On the edge of the Galician town of Betanzos lies a remarkable park that once invited visitors into a world of spectacle, curiosity, and instruction. Its terraces, winding walkways, fountains, statues, grottos, and brightly decorated walls created an experience that was far more ambitious than a simple garden for leisure. Here, scenes from world history stood beside images of famous monuments, scientific progress, industry, and invention. The place was known as the Pasatiempo, and behind it stood Juan Garcia Navarra, a man born in Betanzos, who left for the Americas as a young man, built a fortune in Buenos Aires with his brother, Jesus, and later returned home determined to leave a lasting mark on his native land. For decades after his return, the wealth of the family transformed Betanzos through public works and charitable institutions. But the Pasatiempo was their most unusual creation. Though damaged by long years of neglect and violence, it still reveals the scale of their imagination. It was conceived not merely as a park, but as a statement about the modern world and Galicia's place within it. Across Galicia, towns and villages preserve the traces of emigrants who made fortunes abroad and sent part of that success back home. Schools, hospitals, fountains, civic buildings, and homes for the poor appeared through the generosity of those who had crossed the Atlantic. Yet the Navarra brothers stood apart because of the extraordinary breadth of their vision. The Pasatiempo reflected the spirit of the great world fairs of the modern age, but it transplanted that spirit into a provincial setting that few would have associated with such global ambition. It was playful, theatrical, and educational all at once. Its displays celebrated travel, discovery, technology, commerce, and the wider horizons opened by migration. It also prepared young people for a world beyond the narrow limits of local life. In that sense, the park was not simply an ornament, it was a lesson in movement, curiosity, and modernity. Its message was clear. Galicia was not an isolated corner watching the world from afar. It was connected, and its people had already proven that they could move across oceans and take part in a much larger story. That idea captures one of the deepest truths about Galicia. At first glance, it appears to be a remote land of broken terrain, hidden valleys, rocky headlands, and difficult routes. For centuries, distance and rugged geography gave it the reputation of a marginal place at the far end of Europe. Yet that same land has long been woven into broad networks of travel, exchange, religion, and migration. In the modern age, Galician communities spread across the Americas, while keeping close ties to the villages they had left behind. Those links were emotional, financial, and cultural. They turned separation into solidarity. Out of hardship, exile, and movement emerged a stronger sense of collective identity. Galicia's peripheral position did not cut it off from the world. Again and again it pushed Galicia outward, forcing its people to build connections across great distances. This is the central paradox of the region. It has often seemed far away, but it has rarely been truly disconnected. That paradox shaped Galicia's history long before the age of mass emigration. In the early medieval world, the region stood at what many regarded as the edge of Christendom. It was distant, imperfectly known, and sometimes viewed with suspicion. Yet this apparent remoteness became the very reason for its rise to extraordinary importance. The discovery of the tomb identified with St. James transformed Galicia into one of the great spiritual destinations of medieval Europe. Pilgrims from many lands journeyed to Compostela, and what had once been the far western limit of the Christian world became one of its central, sacred destinations. The route to the end of the earth became a route towards salvation, and Galicia gained a new meaning in the religious imagination of Europe. A place that had seemed distant was recast as spiritually central. For centuries, pilgrims travelled from across Latin Christendom to reach the shrine of St. James. They came by land and sea, facing dangers, hardship, and uncertainty. When they returned home, they carried the reputation of the apostle with them. His cult spread far beyond Galicia, and his image appeared in churches and devotional art across Europe. He was shown as a traveller marked by staff, satchel, and shell, a holy guide for those who crossed unfamiliar roads. Through those travellers, the fame of Compostela reached distant regions, and Galicia became known even to people who had never set foot in it. The saint's presence travelled far beyond his shrine, and the landscape of devotion across Europe came to include this western land in a very direct way. Yet the road to Compostela had older foundations. Long before St. James drew pilgrims westward, Roman power had already linked Galicia to the larger world. Soldiers, administrators, engineers, and miners bound the region to the structures of the empire. Roads cut through hostile terrain, bridges spanned rivers, mines extracted immense wealth, and the great lighthouse at A Coruña stood against wind and mist at the ocean's edge, a powerful symbol of imperial reach. Roman Galicia was not a forgotten frontier. It was an active part of a wider system of movement, production, and communication. The remains of that world continue to shape later memory. Monuments, walls, roads, and towers reminded later generations that this land had long stood at the meeting point of local life and wider horizons. The same openness appears in other, unexpected traces scattered across Galicia. Ancient churches preserve objects and stories that point toward places far beyond the region. One monument could evoke Jerusalem. Another might preserve the memory of a traveller returning from the eastern Mediterranean. Medieval wills and obituaries speak of journeys to the Holy Land, showing that people from Galicia joined the wider movement of Christian travel long before such voyages became commonplace. These were not symbolic gestures. They were real acts of devotion, risk, and endurance. Even from a region described as remote, people set out toward the sacred centres of the Christian world, and some returned carrying relics, stories, and prestige. The roots of this religious mobility reach back into late antiquity. The 5th century bishop Hydatius, writing in a troubled age, remembered his own youthful journey to the Holy Land. Even from the western limits of the old Roman world, he belonged to a culture still connected to distant places, visitors, and ideas. Around the same broader world of Christian travel stands the figure of Egeria, the woman whose account of pilgrimage remains one of the earliest and most vivid testimonies of its kind. Whether or not she came from Galicia, her narrative found a deep resonance in the northwest of Iberia. Her journey represented courage, devotion, and a sense that even those from the edge of the known world could claim direct access to its sacred heart. That idea mattered greatly in a land where distance was both obstacle and invitation. Throughout the early Middle Ages, Galicia continued to be described as distant, but people within and beyond the region repeatedly crossed that distance. Religious travellers, monks, bishops, refugees, and missionaries moved through it and into it. Martin of Braga, born far away in Pannonia, travelled through the eastern Mediterranean before reaching the northwest of Iberia, where he became one of the defining religious figures of the age. He brought with him not only personal holiness, but also the intellectual and spiritual traditions of Eastern monasticism. In Galicia, those traditions were adapted, translated, and rooted in local soil. Later, churchmen and monastic founders built upon that foundation, creating a regional, religious culture that was deeply local but never closed in upon itself. It absorbed influences from the Mediterranean world, while developing a character of its own. The upheavals that followed the rise of Islam also reshaped Galicia, even if Muslim armies barely mastered its difficult interior. Raids, fear, and political disruption touched the region, and Christian refugees from other parts of Iberia moved northward, bringing with them skills, memories, and religious traditions. Some restored monasteries, others left only faint traces in local place names. Their presence added another layer to the region's already complex identity. Galicia was not sealed off from the great shocks of Mediterranean history. It felt their impact, sometimes indirectly, but often in ways that enriched and altered its religious and cultural life. Even when contacts grew thinner, the region continued to look outward toward Rome, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the wider Christian world. Its sacred landscape reflected that broad orientation. Churches, chapels, altars, saints' cults, and local dedications reveal a spiritual geography filled with names and devotions drawn from many lands. St. James would later dominate this world, but he entered a region already accustomed to adopting and reshaping influences from afar. Galicia also looked north. The cult of St. Martin of Tours gained deep roots here, linking the region not only to the Mediterranean but also to Gaul and the Atlantic routes of Western Europe. Those contacts endured for centuries. Kings, clerics, merchants, and pilgrims maintained channels between Galicia and lands across the sea. The coast was dangerous, but it was also open. Sea routes remained difficult, yet viable, carrying not only goods and raiders, but also ideas, relics, letters, and ambitions. That same Atlantic openness exposed Galicia to violence. Viking raids struck its coasts, killed churchmen, and forced some bishops to abandon their sees. Yet even these assaults show how connected Galicia had become to the maritime world of northern Europe. The sea that brought pilgrims and commerce also brought danger. Over time, the same waters linked Galicia to Norman diplomacy, to England, to France, and to the wider political struggles of medieval Europe. Pilgrims increasingly arrived by ship. Traders energized the ports. Wars elsewhere redirected traffic toward Galician shores. English, French, and other travelers knew the harbors of Galicia, and the region became entangled in dynastic conflict as well as devotion. What may look like a remote coast on the map was in practice part of a moving Atlantic corridor. These links stretched back even further. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, communities from the British world established themselves on the northwestern coast. Texts, objects, and artistic influences passed between Galicia and the Atlantic regions, beyond the Bay of Biscay. Contacts with Ireland, Britain, and Brittany did not erase Galicia's southern and Mediterranean ties. Instead, they added another dimension to its history. The region stood between worlds. It looked toward Rome and Jerusalem, but also toward Tours, the British Isles, and the oceanic routes of the far west. This double orientation helps explain much of Galicia's character. It was never only a margin of Iberia, it was also a threshold. Even before Rome, Galicia had been part of wider systems of exchange. Prehistoric trade connected the Atlantic facade of Europe with the Mediterranean. The Iron Age cultures of northwestern Iberia shared traits with communities along the oceanic rim. Ancient rock carvings, hill forts, and megalithic monuments still mark the landscape with evidence of very old patterns of movement, ritual, and connection. These remains point to a deep past in which Galicia was already participating in networks larger than itself. Long before medieval pilgrims walked to Compostela or emigrants sailed for Buenos Aires, people in this land were engaging with worlds beyond their immediate horizon. This long history explains why Galicia resists simple definitions. It has often been described as distant, poor, backward, or peripheral. Yet such labels collapse under the weight of the evidence. Again and again, Galicia appears as a place shaped by movement. Pilgrims crossed it. Merchants sailed from it. Refugees settled in it. Saints, monks, and ideas entered it from afar. Its people left for other continents and transformed their homeland from abroad. Its landscape may be fractured, but its history is full of connection. Its horizons have never been as narrow as outsiders imagined. What seems like an endpoint on the map has repeatedly become a centre of exchange, imagination, and identity. That is the enduring force of Galicia's paradox, and it is what makes the region's story so compelling. The world of the Castros is not only a distant archaeological phase in Galicia's past. It has also played a powerful role in shaping how the region understands itself in modern times. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, writers, intellectuals, and political thinkers turned to this prehistoric landscape and reimagined it as the foundation of a Celtic Galicia. Through this idea, identity was reshaped, and the region was symbolically reconnected to other Atlantic lands. These imagined ancestors linked Galicia to places that shared similar experiences of marginalization, migration, and cultural resistance. The story of exile and endurance, already familiar in Galician life, was projected back into deep antiquity. In this vision, the past was not silent. It offered a narrative of strength, resilience, and continuity that seemed to explain the character of the present. This reconstructed Celtic identity was filled with virtues that 19th century thinkers admired and wished to claim. Courage in the face of domination, a refusal to submit, deep attachment to homeland, strong religious feeling, poetic sensitivity, and ancient wisdom were all attributed to these early inhabitants. At the same time, difficult questions about the actual origins of these peoples were often set aside. Instead, the focus remained on what this imagined past could provide for the present. It allowed Galicia to distinguish itself from the Mediterranean cultures that had shaped much of Iberian history. It offered a different lineage, one rooted in the Atlantic world rather than in classical or southern traditions. In doing so, it created a sense of uniqueness that could support cultural pride and political expression. The influence of this Celtic vision extended far beyond historical writing. It entered literature, music, and popular culture. Poets and authors drew upon Celtic legends and themes, blending them with local traditions and landscapes. Ancient heroes, mythical journeys, and magical figures became part of Galicia's cultural expression. Over time, these elements filtered into everyday life, appearing in festivals, artistic performances, and regional symbols. Even when some of these traditions were newly created or adapted for modern audiences, they carried the appearance of deep antiquity. The idea of a Celtic past became part of how Galicia presented itself, both to its own people and to outsiders. In the present, this legacy remains visible, though its meaning has changed. Music, dance, folklore, and visual arts often evoke a Celtic atmosphere, whether through traditional instruments, costumes, or imagery. Some of these expressions are closely tied to historical traditions, while others are shaped by tourism and cultural marketing. The sense of continuity with an ancient past remains appealing, but the assumptions that once supported it have become more uncertain. The racial and historical claims that earlier generations accepted with confidence are now widely questioned. The Celtic identity of Galicia, once presented as a clear and defining truth, has become more complex and less certain under modern scrutiny. Across Europe, the idea of the Celts has undergone a major transformation. As political structures have shifted and societies have become more interconnected, older nationalist interpretations have been reconsidered. In regions where Celtic identity has been strongly defended, especially in parts of the British Isles, scholars have emphasized the diversity of ancient cultures and the absence of clear evidence for large-scale migrations that would explain a unified Celtic people. Instead, similarities in material culture and practices appear to have spread through contact and adaptation rather than through a single shared origin. This has weakened the idea of a homogeneous Celtic world and replaced it with a more nuanced understanding of cultural exchange. At the same time, the modern use of Celtic identity has moved in new directions. Earlier associations with racial theories and exclusive nationalism have largely lost their credibility, especially in light of the consequences of such ideas in modern history. In their place, Celtic themes now appear in a wide range of cultural expressions that cross national boundaries. Music festivals, artistic movements, spiritual practices, and ecological ideas all draw upon this imagery. The figure of the Celt has shifted from a symbol of ethnic purity to a more flexible and global cultural reference. In some contexts, it has even been presented as a shared heritage that connects different parts of Europe rather than dividing them. For Galicia, the long fascination with a Celtic past has had lasting consequences. Unlike in Ireland or Wales, where language and medieval literature provide a strong and continuous link to earlier traditions, Galicia's connection to this imagined past rests more heavily on archaeology, folklore, and interpretation. Place names and oral traditions offer clues, but they do not provide a clear or continuous narrative. As a result, the Celtic past in Galicia has always depended more on reconstruction than on direct inheritance. It is a story built from fragments, shaped by imagination as much as by evidence. This difference has influenced how identity is constructed. In regions with a living linguistic and literary tradition, the past can be filled with detailed stories, heroes, and cultural continuity. In Galicia, the absence of such a continuous record has encouraged a different approach. The past is often more symbolic, more open to reinterpretation, and more closely tied to landscape and material remains. Ancient settlements, burial sites, and stone monuments become anchors for identity, even when their exact meaning remains uncertain. The result is a powerful but less clearly defined connection to antiquity. Modern scholarship has tried to move beyond earlier debates by focusing on the culture of the Castros in more concrete terms. Instead of emphasizing ethnicity, researchers examine settlement patterns, social organization, and material culture. This approach highlights connections with other Atlantic regions, without relying on the idea of a single Celtic identity. Yet disagreements persist. Some continue to defend the presence of a Celtic component, while others reject it entirely. In some cases, new scientific methods have been used to support older arguments, giving them a different form without resolving the underlying questions. Even when stripped of explicit ethnic claims, the emphasis on prehistoric culture continues to shape perceptions of Galicia. By locating the roots of identity in a distant and largely silent past, it can suggest a sense of timelessness. The rural landscape with its ancient remains appears unchanged across centuries. This impression has sometimes been used to explain the region's economic and social conditions, presenting them as the result of deep historical continuity, rather than recent developments. In this way, the weight of prehistory can influence how the present is understood. A similar pattern appears in the interpretation of Galicia's medieval architecture, especially its Romanesque churches. Scattered across the countryside, these buildings are often seen as simple, conservative, and resistant to change. Their solid stone walls and restrained decoration seem to reflect a society rooted in tradition and isolated from broader developments. Yet this impression does not hold up under closer examination. The sheer number of these churches, built within a relatively short period, reveals an extraordinary level of activity, organisation, and investment. Far from being static, this was a time of intense transformation. Many of these churches were constructed during a period when the Kingdom of Leon stood apart from Castile. While later historians sometimes viewed this era as a setback in the political unification of Spain, it was in fact a moment of remarkable cultural and religious energy. Across Galicia, construction spread rapidly, creating a dense network of buildings that defined the landscape. Villages were marked by carefully built stone churches, often located only a short distance from one another. These structures were not isolated achievements. They formed part of a wider movement that reshaped the region's religious and social life. The simplicity of their decoration does not indicate backwardness. In many cases, it reflects the influence of reform movements that valued restraint and clarity. Monastic orders played a key role in this transformation, introducing new artistic and architectural ideas that were adapted by local craftsmen. Rather than copying these influences directly, builders combined them with existing traditions, creating a distinctive regional style. This process shows creativity and flexibility, and rather than stagnation. It demonstrates how external ideas were absorbed and transformed within a local context. At the same time, some patrons commissioned more elaborate designs, drawing inspiration from major centres such as Santiago de Compostela. These works have sometimes been dismissed as imitations, but they often reveal careful adaptation rather than simple copying. Elements were selected, modified, and integrated into new settings, reflecting both ambition and practical constraints. The result was an architecture that balanced aspiration with local conditions, producing forms that were both familiar and innovative. This environment also shaped the work of one of Galicia's most remarkable medieval artists, known as Master Mateo. His achievements at the Cathedral of Santiago stand out for their scale, complexity, and expressive power. The figures carved under his direction seem alive, engaged in a dramatic and carefully organised vision. His work attracted admiration far beyond Galicia, and over time his reputation grew into something close to legend. He became a symbol of artistic genius, a rare figure in a world where most craftsmen remain anonymous. Yet this focus on a single master has also overshadowed the broader artistic landscape. By emphasizing individual genius, it has encouraged the view that other works are merely derivative. This perspective overlooks the diversity and vitality of artistic production across the region. Even buildings that appear to echo Mateo's style often do so in creative ways, adapting his ideas to new context and purposes. In some cases, later structures deliberately evoke his work not as copies, but as reinterpretations suited to different audiences and moments. The interaction between influence and innovation can be seen in several important monuments. Some churches incorporate elements associated with Mateo's designs, but rearrange them to fit new architectural frameworks. Others engage more directly with his ideas, creating spaces that respond to his work while introducing new, stylistic features. These examples show that artistic development in Galicia did not follow a simple path of decline or repetition. Instead, it involved ongoing dialogue, experimentation, and adaptation. This broader perspective reveals a very different picture of Galicia's past. Rather than a land defined by isolation and inertia, it emerges as a place shaped by movement, exchange, and creative transformation. Its prehistoric heritage, its medieval architecture, and its modern identity all reflect the same underlying pattern. External influences were never simply imposed. They were absorbed, reshaped, and given new meaning. What appears at first as marginal or peripheral often turns out to be deeply connected to wider currents. When modern observers judged certain monuments as little more than faded imitations of a celebrated masterpiece, it was almost inevitable that the rural churches of Galicia would be treated even more harshly. A few exceptional examples managed to stand out. where artists responded to prestigious models in striking and original ways. In places like Portomarine or Ribas de Minho, sculptural programs and architectural compositions reveal a creative engagement with major artistic traditions. Yet, these cases were often seen as rare exceptions. Far more commonly, the repeated use of familiar decorative patterns led to a sweeping conclusion that rural Romanesque art lacked innovation and vitality. The widespread reliance on foliage motifs, geometric ornament, and restrained surfaces reinforced the idea that this was a static and conservative artistic world. This judgment was further strengthened by the relative absence of large-scale figural sculpture in many rural churches. Compared to the monumental and expressive works found in major centres, these buildings seemed modest, even silent. In contrast, the art of Compostela appeared dynamic, ambitious, and full of personality. It was associated with powerful patrons, clearly defined artistic programs, and named masters whose identities could be traced. That contrast shaped the narrative for generations. The countryside became a place of repetition, while Compostela represented creativity and progress. Such interpretations reveal more about modern expectations than about medieval realities. The tendency to focus on named artists and grand monuments has often overshadowed the contributions of anonymous craftsmen working in less visible settings. In fact, the decorative language developed in rural Galicia tells a far more complex story. Even elements that appear simple at first glance, such as the cusped lintel, open a window onto a world of experimentation, adaptation, and meaning. These forms were not random ornaments, they were part of a broader visual vocabulary that reflected social, political, and religious dynamics across the region. The cusped lintel, found in numerous churches, provides a striking example of how artistic ideas circulated and evolved. Its origins can be traced to important architectural models, where it formed part of carefully designed entrances. From there, it spread into the countryside, but not in a uniform or mechanical way. Builders and patrons adapted the form to suit different needs, combining it with other elements, altering its proportions, and integrating it into new contexts. What might seem like a simplified version of an original design was often the result of deliberate choices rather than a loss of skill. This process of adaptation was closely tied to the distribution of power. Artistic forms did not travel randomly. They followed routes shaped by authority, influence, and competition. Certain churches and regions acted as centres, while others became connected through networks of patronage and control. The presence of specific architectural features could signal allegiance, ownership, or ambition. In this sense, decoration was not merely aesthetic. It was also a form of communication, marking the reach of institutions and the assertion of claims over territory. At key moments, these artistic choices reflected broader struggles. In areas where ecclesiastical authority was contested, the adoption of recognizable forms could reinforce a claim to legitimacy. When bishops sought to extend their influence into distant regions, architectural motifs associated with major centres served as visual markers of that presence. Even a small rural church could carry a message about power, identity, and belonging. The countryside was not isolated from these dynamics, it was actively shaped by them. At the same time, the meaning of these forms was not fixed. As they spread, they were reinterpreted and combined with local traditions. Decorative patterns multiplied, shifted in scale, and appeared in new settings. Some began to resemble much older motifs found in Roman or even prehistoric contexts. This blending of influences created a layered visual language that connected different periods of Galicia's past. Elements associated with medieval architecture could echo ancient forms, linking contemporary expression to deep historical memory. In some cases, similar designs emerged independently in different locations, drawing on shared cultural references rather than direct imitation. Rural craftsmen were not simply copying what they saw elsewhere. They were responding to a wide range of influences, including local materials, earlier monuments, and the expectations of their communities. This process produced a rich variety of forms that cannot be reduced to a single line of development. It shows how creativity operated within constraints, transforming limited resources into distinctive expressions. Monastic networks played an important role in shaping this environment. Reform movements introduced new ideals and practices, but they did not erase existing traditions. Instead, they were integrated into a landscape already marked by centuries of religious activity. Ancient sites, early Christian remains, and established patterns of devotion provided a foundation upon which new forms could be built. Monasteries became centres of continuity as well as change, linking past and present in visible ways. In certain regions, the interaction between tradition and innovation reached particularly striking levels. Churches incorporated elements that recalled major pilgrimage centres, while also introducing new stylistic features. Architectural designs could reference distant models, while remaining firmly rooted in local conditions. This combination of influences created spaces that were both familiar and new, reflecting a dynamic cultural environment rather than a static one. The broader rural landscape of Galicia reveals a similar pattern of continuity and transformation. Far from being frozen in time, it has been shaped by successive layers of history. Prehistoric settlements, Roman infrastructure, early Christian institutions, and medieval developments all contributed to its formation. Each layer left traces that continued to influence later generations. The result is a landscape that carries multiple meanings at once, where different periods coexist and interact. This layered past challenges the idea that rural Galicia represents a simple or unchanging tradition. It shows instead a complex process of adaptation, where new elements were constantly integrated into existing structures. The persistence of older forms did not prevent change. It provided a framework within which change could occur. In this way, continuity and transformation were not opposites, but part of the same process. The interpretation of this past has often been shaped by modern concerns. Intellectuals seeking to define regional identity have looked to the countryside as a source of authenticity, emphasizing its connection to ancient traditions. At the same time, others have viewed it as a symbol of backwardness, contrasting it with the perceived progress of urban life. These opposing views reflect broader debates about modernity, tradition, and cultural identity. In recent times, the balance has shifted. Economic and demographic changes have altered the relationship between city and countryside. Rural areas have lost population, while urban centres have grown in importance. Traditional culture has been preserved, adapted, and sometimes transformed into a form of heritage presented to visitors. At the same time, modern projects have redefined Galicia as a place connected to global networks, emphasizing innovation and cosmopolitan identity. This tension between past and present continues to shape how Galicia is understood. On one side stands a vision rooted in tradition, landscape, and memory. On the other stands a forward-looking perspective that highlights development and integration into a wider world. Both draw on elements of the same history, but they emphasize different aspects of it. The challenge lies in recognizing how these layers interact, rather than treating them as separate or opposing forces. A closer examination of Galicia's past reveals that its rural world has never been isolated. It has always been connected, whether through trade, religion, or migration. Even in periods of political instability, local communities maintain networks of exchange and communication. Monasteries, noble estates, and ecclesiastical structures formed a dense web of relationships that sustained economic and social life. These connections allowed the region to adapt to changing circumstances without losing its coherence. The same pattern can be seen in the development of early medieval Galicia. Political authority shifted, external pressures increased, and new powers emerged, but the underlying structures of society remained resilient. Communities continued to organize themselves around established patterns of land use, production, and belief. Rather than a break with the past, this period represents a transformation built on existing foundations. The idea of a unified kingdom associated with Galicia reflects this continuity. It was not simply a political label imposed from above. It drew on earlier structures and identities that had developed over centuries. The region's prominence within broader political formations was rooted in its economic strength, its religious significance, and its established networks. These factors allowed it to play a central role in shaping larger historical developments. At the same time, later interpretations have often obscured this role. Debates about national identity, political unity, and historical origins have tended to focus on other regions, leaving Galicia in the background. Its history has been framed as peripheral or secondary, despite the evidence of its importance. This imbalance reflects the priorities of modern historiography rather than the realities of the past. In truth, Galicia's position cannot be understood in terms of isolation or marginality. Its history shows repeated engagement with wider processes from the spread of Christianity to the formation of medieval kingdoms. The countryside, often seen as static, emerges instead as a space of interaction and change. Its monuments, settlements, and traditions all testify to a long history of adaptation. Early medieval Galicia carried something unusual for its time, a deep and persistent connection to the Roman world. Even as political structures shifted and horizons narrowed, this region preserved a culture rooted in writing, law, and memory. Latin literacy remained strong, visible in the widespread use of charters and in a taste for elaborate formal language inherited from late antiquity. Inscriptions continue to appear in public spaces, even on bridges, revealing how authority and identity were still expressed through writing. Rather than fading into isolation, Galicia drew strength from these traditions. Its past did not remain frozen. Instead, it acted as a reservoir of ideas that allowed the region to adapt and later take part in shaping the emerging world of medieval Christian Europe. At the same time, memory became a powerful tool. As connections with older centres weakened, local elites began to recreate their place in history through stories, symbols, and sacred traditions. The cult of the Apostle James became central to this effort. It anchored Galicia within the story of early Christianity and linked it to the broader Roman world. Architecture reflected this ambition. Ancient Roman materials were reused in new churches, and sacred spaces were designed to echo older imperial and religious landscapes. Even the organization of territory around these sites drew on biblical models. The result was not a simple imitation of the past, but a creative reimagining of it, blending Roman, Gothic, and biblical elements into a new identity. This blending shaped the political culture of the Asturian kingdom. Rulers and clerics constructed genealogies, revived old royal names, and promoted rituals that connected them to both ancient kings and sacred history. Chronicles emphasized continuity with the Visigothic past, while art and architecture displayed a cosmopolitan style that reached beyond local boundaries. Legends filled the gaps, telling stories of miraculous journeys and sacred objects that tied the region to distant lands. These efforts were not random. They reflected a desire to overcome geographical isolation and to place Galicia within a universal Christian narrative. Despite its strong ties to Rome and the Mediterranean, Galicia was also part of a wider Atlantic world. Its connections with the British Isles reveal a shared cultural outlook, shaped by distance and imagination. Communities in Ireland and Britain, like those in Galicia, viewed themselves on the edge of the known world, yet deeply connected to a sacred centre. They looked toward Rome with awe, while also creating local versions of holy places. Monasteries and churches use stone, relics, and art to recreate the spiritual authority of distant landmarks. Pilgrimage, both real and imagined, became a way to bridge the gap between periphery and centre. In these regions, geography and spirituality were closely linked. The far edges of the world were not empty spaces, but places filled with meaning. Monks and travellers described distant lands, heavenly cities, and mysterious journeys across seas. Stories of voyages to otherworldly islands or visions of paradise reflected a deep concern with humanity's place in the divine plan. These narratives transformed remote landscapes into stages for spiritual exploration. Fear and wonder coexisted, shaping a worldview in which the unknown became a path to redemption. Galicia shared in this expansive imagination. Its most famous monument, the great Roman lighthouse known as the Tower of Hercules, became more than a relic of the past. It entered legend as a point of connection between lands and peoples. Medieval writers linked it to stories of migration, conquest, and discovery. From its heights, distant shores could be seen, inspiring tales of journeys that connected Iberia with Ireland and beyond. These stories drew on earlier descriptions of the Roman world, where the edges of the empire were understood as the limits of human experience. Maps and texts reinforced this vision. Religious works presented the world not just as geography, but as a spiritual landscape shaped by divine history. Galicia appeared within these maps as part of a larger story of creation, fall, and salvation. The edges of the earth were no longer marginal, they were essential to understanding the whole. In this context, Galicia's position became meaningful. It was both a boundary and a bridge, linking different parts of the Christian world. Over time, pilgrimage and cultural exchange transformed this vision into reality. Routes leading to Compostela brought travellers, ideas, and artistic styles from across Europe. The Shrine of St. James became one of the most important destinations in Christendom. It attracted not only pilgrims, but also craftsmen, scholars, and clergy. The region absorbed influences from abroad while contributing its own traditions to a shared culture. This movement reshaped Galicia, turning it into an active participant in the development of medieval Europe. The growth of pilgrimage also changed how space was understood. Compostela was no longer a remote destination at the edge of the world. It became a central point in a vast network connecting cities, monasteries, and kingdoms. The journey itself gained meaning, symbolizing both physical travel and spiritual transformation. The cathedral at Compostela reflected this idea. Its design guided visitors through a sequence of spaces that mirrored the experience of pilgrimage, blending architecture, art, and ritual into a unified whole. Inside the cathedral, symbolism replaced the need for physical relics or direct connections to distant lands. Sculptures, altars, and decorative programs recreated sacred events and locations. Visitors could experience a kind of spiritual journey without leaving the building. The architecture itself became a narrative, telling the story of salvation from creation to the end of time. This approach turned the cathedral into more than a place of worship. It became a representation of the entire Christian world. The artistic program reached its peak in the grand entrance, where imagery from across Europe was brought together in a single composition. Different styles and traditions were combined, reflecting the diversity of the pilgrimage routes that led to Compostela. This deliberate mixture was not accidental. It expressed the universal nature of the shrine and its role as a meeting point for cultures. The result was a space that embodied the idea of unity within diversity, a central theme of medieval Christianity. At the same time, the shrine's growing importance was supported by stories and texts that emphasized its global reach. Accounts of miracles described visitors from every corner of the known world. Narratives of journeys and discoveries reinforced the idea that Compostela was connected to all regions of Christendom. These stories were carefully shaped to present the shrine as both ancient and universal, rooted in the past yet open to the world. Through these developments, Galicia transformed its position. What had once been seen as a distant edge became a place of connection and influence. Its traditions, shaped by Roman heritage and local innovation, allowed it to participate fully in the cultural and religious life of medieval Europe. The region's history challenges simple ideas of centre and periphery. It shows how a place can be both remote and central at the same time. Galicia's medieval past stretches across a long and complex journey, beginning in the final centuries of the Roman Empire and continuing through the rise of early kingdoms, the growth of pilgrimage, and the cultural flowering of the 13th century. Over time, this region moved from the margins of imperial power into a position of surprising influence. Its story is not limited to a single city or monument, but unfolds through shifting political structures, evolving cultural traditions, and the steady transformation of society itself. From the early formation of regional identity to the vibrant court culture of King Alfonso X, Galicia reveals a dynamic and interconnected world. This history raises larger questions about how regions are defined and how they change over time. What appears as a remote corner on a modern map once functioned as an active crossroads of ideas, trade, and belief. Boundaries that later seemed fixed were once fluid, overlapping, and constantly negotiated. Small communities, rural parishes, and local networks were deeply connected to broader systems that stretched across Europe and beyond. Galicia was not isolated. It was part of a layered world where local and global influences constantly interacted. Understanding this transformation requires a shift in perspective. Galicia cannot be seen simply as a peripheral land reacting to outside forces. Instead, it must be recognized as a place where older traditions were reshaped and new ideas were actively adopted and adapted. The region's past was not only remembered but reimagined. Ancient legacies, whether historical or symbolic, played a role in shaping identity and guiding change. These traditions helped legitimize new political structures and cultural developments, allowing Galicia to participate fully in the evolving world of medieval Christendom. Even Compostela, often treated as the central focus, is only one part of a much broader picture. The countryside, with its dense network of settlements and communities, played a crucial role in shaping the region's development. Rural society was not passive. It contributed to economic growth, supported religious institutions, and sustained cultural life. Change did not flow only from major cities or powerful institutions. It emerged from the interaction between local communities and wider networks of exchange. One of the most intriguing periods in this story is the early medieval kingdom established by the Sueves. For centuries, this kingdom captured the imagination of historians and writers, often becoming a symbol of independence and distinct identity. In later interpretations, these early rulers were portrayed as founders of a unique political tradition, even though the historical evidence for their rule is limited. Figures from this era, along with religious personalities like Priscillian, were reshaped in later narratives to serve modern ideas of identity and belonging. This fascination with origins was not unique to Galicia. Across Europe, scholars and writers searched for the beginnings of nations in the remains of the Roman world. In Galicia's case, however, this search sometimes obscured a more complex reality. The emphasis on difference and separation overlooked the deep connections that tied the region to the Roman and Christian worlds. Rather than standing apart, Galicia remained firmly linked to broader cultural and political systems. The Suevic Kingdom itself did not emerge in isolation. It developed within a landscape already shaped by centuries of Roman administration and cultural integration. The structures of governance, patterns of settlement, and religious institutions that defined the region were deeply rooted in this earlier period. The Sueves built upon these foundations, reinforcing and adapting them, rather than replacing them entirely. Their rule represents a stage in a longer process, not a sudden beginning. When examined more closely, the evidence for this period reveals a society that was more continuous than previously assumed. Written sources, though limited, suggest that many aspects of life remained connected to earlier traditions. Archaeological discoveries point to ongoing patterns of settlement and economic activity that blur the line between Roman and post-Roman worlds. Even religious institutions show signs of continuity, with established structures evolving rather than disappearing. This continuity extends to the political sphere. The rulers of this early kingdom were not isolated figures, but participants in wider networks of power. Through diplomacy, warfare, and economic exchange, they engaged with neighbouring regions and larger imperial systems. Coinage and material culture reflect these connections, revealing how local authority was expressed within a broader framework of influence. Geography also played a key role in shaping Galicia's development. Positioned along important maritime routes, the region served as a link between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Trade and communication flowed through its ports, connecting it to distant lands. These connections allowed Galicia to remain engaged with wider economic and political networks, even during periods of upheaval. Religious life in this era further highlights the region's integration into a larger world. Far from being isolated, Galician church leaders maintained contact with communities across Europe and the Mediterranean. They participated in debates, shared ideas, and contributed to the development of Christian doctrine and practice. The spread of churches, monasteries, and religious institutions reflects a society actively engaged in shaping its spiritual landscape. Controversies and debates within the church were not signs of isolation or backwardness. Instead, they mirrored discussions taking place across the Christian world. The development of doctrine, the organization of religious life, and the relationship between church and society were part of a shared process that extended far beyond Galicia. This participation underscores the region's place within a broader network of cultural and intellectual exchange. By looking beyond narrow interpretations focused on ethnicity or political independence, a more nuanced picture emerges. Galicia appears not as a distant outpost, but as a region deeply embedded in the transformations that defined late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Its history reflects the blending of local traditions with external influences, creating a unique yet connected cultural landscape. Recent research continues to expand this understanding. Archaeological studies reveal increasingly detailed insights into settlement patterns, economic activity, and social organization. Evidence of trade, production, and daily life provides a clearer picture of how communities functioned and interacted. These findings challenge older assumptions and highlight the complexity of the region's development. At the same time, the study of religious texts and practices offers valuable perspectives on cultural change. The evolution of belief, the spread of religious institutions, and the role of clergy in society all contribute to a deeper understanding of how medieval Christianity took shape. Galicia's contribution to this process is significant. demonstrating the region's active role in shaping the spiritual life of the period. Modern perspectives also influence how this history is interpreted. Changes in the contemporary world, including greater interconnectedness and the shifting role of national identities, have encouraged new ways of thinking about the past. Rather than focusing solely on independence or isolation, current approaches emphasize interaction, exchange, and integration. Seen in this light, Galicia's early history takes on new meaning. It is no longer viewed simply as an isolated experiment in statehood, but as part of a broader pattern of regional development within a connected world. Its legacy lies not in separation, but in its ability to integrate diverse influences and contribute to larger cultural systems. This long process of transformation laid the groundwork for later developments. The rise of pilgrimage, the growth of Compostela, and the cultural achievements of the medieval period all build upon these earlier foundations. Galicia's past is therefore not a story of decline or marginality, but one of adaptation, continuity, and connection. Most narratives about early medieval Iberia tend to begin with the arrival of the Sueves, placing them at the centre of Galicia's early history. Yet many of these accounts rely on interpretations that no longer reflect current research. Over time, a noticeable gap has opened between traditional summaries and more recent scholarly work. One major reason for this shift lies in how historians now classify the period before the Arab conquests. Instead of viewing it as the opening stage of the Middle Ages, it is increasingly understood as the final phase of the ancient Roman world. The kingdoms that emerged in this era, including those of the Visigoths and the Sueves, are no longer seen as something entirely new, but rather as continuations of older systems shaped by Roman administration and culture. This change in perspective has complicated the work of medieval historians. As interpretations of late antiquity evolve, it becomes harder to maintain a clear boundary between ancient and medieval history. The Suevic Kingdom, once treated as an early medieval state, is now often placed within a broader late Roman context. This approach has its advantages, especially in highlighting how these so-called barbarian kingdoms relied on inherited Roman structures. At the same time, it creates challenges because the evidence itself remains limited and difficult to interpret. The core problem lies in the scarcity of written sources. The history of the Sueves rests on a handful of texts that have been examined repeatedly for generations. For the 5th century, there are only brief mentions in a few narratives and a more detailed but still limited chronicle written by a bishop in the northwest of Iberia. Later centuries offer even less. A few religious writers and chroniclers provide scattered references, but nothing like a continuous account. After that, the record falls silent. The likelihood of discovering new written material is extremely low, and past claims of major discoveries have repeatedly proven unreliable. Because of this, much modern research often revisits the same evidence, reaching similar conclusions again and again. The result is a sense of stagnation. However, this does not mean that progress is impossible. New approaches, especially in archaeology and numismatics, are beginning to offer fresh insights into the period. Archaeology, in particular, has begun to transform understanding of the region, even if its contributions are uneven. Excavations have revealed more about settlements, especially hilltop communities and urban centres. Some cities are gradually becoming better understood, offering glimpses into daily life and urban development. Across northern Iberia, patterns of settlement suggest long-term continuity rather than sudden disruption. These findings highlight the deep roots of regional structures that predate the arrival of the Sueves. At the same time, archaeology has its limits. It is often difficult to connect material remains directly to specific groups or identities. Objects cannot easily reveal who used them, or how those people define themselves. Attempts to link certain types of artifacts to particular ethnic groups have been widely questioned. In Galicia, the situation is even more challenging, as the material record lacks many of the objects traditionally associated with so-called barbarian populations. This makes it difficult to isolate anything distinctly Suevic in the archaeological evidence. Coins, however, are beginning to tell a more detailed story. Recent discoveries and careful analysis have revealed patterns that were previously overlooked. These coins show connections between the Suevic rulers, the Visigothic kingdom, and the remnants of Roman authority. They suggest a complex web of relationships in which local rulers operated within broader political frameworks. In some cases, they even hint at how these rulers presented themselves, borrowing symbols and ideas from imperial traditions. The Suevis themselves arrived in northwestern Iberia in the early 5th century, after crossing into Gaul and eventually moving south during a period of civil conflict within the Roman Empire. When they entered the peninsula, they encountered a landscape already divided into administrative regions shaped by centuries of Roman rule. After a period of instability and conflict, they established themselves in the northwest, sharing control of the region before eventually becoming its dominant power. From this base, their rulers sought to expand their influence. Their ambitions extended beyond their initial territory, especially toward key cities in the south and east. One of their main targets was a major administrative centre that held both political and symbolic importance. Evidence from archaeological layers suggests episodes of destruction during this time, reflecting the violence described in written accounts. These campaigns were not simple raids. They appear to have been attempts to establish lasting control, although such efforts often met resistance and required repeated withdrawals. Throughout this period, power was not clearly defined. Local elites, regional factions, and external forces all played a role in shaping events. Some local groups may have preferred Suevic rule to direct control from distant authorities, suggesting that alliances shifted depending on circumstances. Rather than a clear division between conquerors and subjects, the situation resembled a complex network of competing interests. The Sueves were not isolated in this process. Their relationship with the Visigoths adds another layer of complexity. The Visigothic rulers, operating from their own centres of power, often acted as mediators or overseers in Iberian affairs. They sought to manage the balance of power, sometimes supporting the Sueves and at other times restraining them. This relationship reflected both cooperation and rivalry, shaped by broader political developments in the collapsing Roman world. Evidence suggests that Suevic rulers may have operated within a framework influenced by both Gothic and Roman traditions. Their use of coinage and political symbolism indicates an awareness of imperial authority, even if their actual relationship with it remains unclear. In some cases, they appear to have positioned themselves as subordinate allies, while in others they acted independently. This ambiguity reflects the transitional nature of the period. By the mid-5th century, tensions reached a breaking point. A Visigothic campaign, supported by imperial authority, brought an end to the established Suevic monarchy. The ruling dynasty was destroyed, and with it, the structure that had held the region together. What followed was a period of fragmentation, marked by competing leaders and shifting alliances. Without a central authority, local conflicts intensified, revealing divisions that had previously been contained. After this moment, the historical record becomes almost completely silent. For nearly a century, little is known about the region's political developments. When information reappears, it shows a reconstituted kingdom, but one that is far less visible than before. The lack of detail makes it difficult to reconstruct events, leaving historians to rely on brief and indirect references. In this later phase, religious life becomes the most visible aspect of the region's history. The emergence of influential church figures and the organisation of ecclesiastical structures provide some insight into how society functioned. These developments suggest a degree of stability and integration that contrasts with the earlier period of conflict. One figure stands out in this context: an outsider who arrived from distant lands and became deeply involved in shaping the region's religious life. His influence reflects the continued connections between Galicia and the wider world. Despite its distance, the region remained part of broader networks of communication, belief, and cultural exchange. Religious debates, moral teachings, and institutional reforms linked it to developments across Europe and beyond. The organisation of rural communities and the spread of churches indicate a society that was actively evolving. These structures may reflect both religious initiatives and earlier patterns of governance. However, it remains difficult to separate what was specifically tied to Suevic rule from what belonged to a broader regional tradition. Archaeological patterns reinforce this sense of continuity and change. The increasing use of fortified settlements may point to a less secure environment, although such developments had already begun before the arrival of the Sueves. Changes in burial practices and material culture suggest shifting social structures, but they do not clearly identify specific ethnic groups. By the late 6th century, the Suevic Kingdom faced its final challenge. A powerful Visigothic ruler launched a campaign that brought the entire peninsula under a single authority. After a series of conflicts and political tensions, the remaining Suevic leadership was defeated. The kingdom was absorbed into a larger state, and its independent existence came to an end. Although the political structure disappeared, the region itself retained a distinct identity. Even under new rulers, Galicia continued to be treated as a unique area requiring special attention and administrative arrangements. This sense of difference did not begin with the Sueves. It had much deeper roots, shaped by geography, history, and earlier forms of organisation. The legacy of this period is therefore complex. The Suevic Kingdom represents one stage in a long process of regional development. It did not create Galicia's identity, but it contributed to shaping it. The structures and traditions that define the region continue to evolve, influenced by both internal dynamics and external connections. The names Galicia and Galicia are often treated as if they describe the same place, and in many ways they do follow a natural linguistic evolution from the Roman world into the modern one. Yet the transformation from one into the other was neither simple nor inevitable. What later became medieval Galicia did not emerge automatically from the Roman province. Instead, it took shape slowly, through centuries of political change, cultural adaptation, and religious development. By the Middle Ages, a Christian Galicia had formed, with boundaries that closely resemble the region known today, though at times it extended into nearby territories such as Bierzo. This outcome was the result of a long and complex process in which the Suevic monarchy played a decisive role, especially during the 6th century when its rulers embraced Catholic Christianity. Working closely with the Church, they contributed to a sense of unity that would survive even after the region was absorbed into the Visigothic kingdom. To understand this transformation, it is necessary to look back to the Roman creation of Galicia. This was not a natural region, but an administrative construct imposed on a landscape inhabited by diverse communities. These groups shared certain cultural traits, yet they were far from uniform. Archaeology reveals a broad cultural zone in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, stretching across modern Galicia, parts of Leon, northern Portugal, and western Asturias. Within this area, people lived in fortified hilltop settlements, known for their strong defensive walls and their visibility in the surrounding terrain. These communities were shaped over centuries, drawing on traditions that reached back to the late Bronze Age, while also absorbing influences from neighbouring regions and distant trade networks. Despite these shared features, internal differences were significant. The populations grouped under the name Galaezi were not a single people, but a collection of communities with distinct identities. The Roman labels simplified a much more complex reality. Some groups had Celtic elements, but others did not, and the cultural landscape included multiple languages and traditions. Over time, the Roman authorities reorganized these societies, creating administrative units that brought them together under a common framework. This process was not merely imposed from above. It involved negotiation and adaptation, as local elites became integrated into the structures of Roman power while maintaining elements of their own traditions. Roman rule transformed the region in profound ways, but it did not erase its earlier character. Instead, it reshaped it. Settlements evolved and new forms of social organization emerged. The traditional hilltop communities continued to exist alongside rural estates that became centers of agricultural production and local authority. These estates reflected the growing importance of landholding elites, who played a key role in the administration of the countryside. Over time, these patterns created a landscape that combined continuity with change, blending indigenous traditions with Roman influence. By late antiquity, this system began to weaken as imperial authority declined. The 5th century was a period of uncertainty and fragmentation. The old structures of Roman administration were no longer able to maintain order, and new forms of power began to emerge. Local elites, fortified settlements, and regional networks took on greater importance. Written accounts from the period describe a world in which authority was divided and contested. Some communities resisted external control, organizing themselves around fortified sites and negotiating with rival powers. Others adapted to the new realities, forming alliances that reflected shifting political conditions. In this environment, the Sueves established themselves in the northwest. Their arrival did not create a completely new order, but it added another layer to an already complex situation. At first, their power was limited and closely tied to individual rulers, rather than to a defined territory. Their authority moved with them, centered on key locations such as Braga, but not yet firmly rooted in a structured state. Over time, however, this changed. The Suevic Kingdom gradually became more organized, developing institutions that allowed it to govern more effectively. A crucial turning point came in the 6th century, when the Suevic rulers adopted Catholic Christianity. This decision reshaped the relationship between the monarchy and the church, creating a partnership that strengthened both. The church provided a framework for organizing the population, while the monarchy offered protection and support. Together, they contributed to the consolidation of the region. Ecclesiastical structures expanded, and dioceses were established in a way that reflected both religious and administrative needs. This network of churches and districts helped integrate diverse communities into a more unified system. The evidence for this transformation can be seen in lists of bishoprics and rural districts, which reveal how the territory was organized. These records show a landscape divided into smaller units, each with its own churches and local centers. The terminology used to describe these divisions reflects the complexity of the process. Older forms of organization were not replaced entirely, but incorporated into a new system. This blending of structures allowed the Suevic Kingdom to extend its influence across the region, even in areas where direct control was limited. Economic activity also played a role in shaping this development. The most densely organized areas were those with the strongest agricultural production and the greatest concentration of wealth. These regions were closely connected to the royal court and the church, forming the core of the kingdom's power. At the same time, more remote areas remained less structured, with weaker connections to central authority. This uneven development highlights the challenges faced by any attempt to unify such a diverse territory. When the Visigoths eventually conquered the Suevic Kingdom, they did not dismantle this system entirely. Instead, they incorporated it into their own administration. The region continued to be treated as a distinct province, with its own structures and traditions. This continuity suggests that the foundations laid during the Suevic period were strong enough to endure political change. The integration was relatively smooth, and there is little evidence of widespread disruption. Local elites likely adapted to the new regime, maintaining their positions within a different political framework. The long-term impact of these developments can be seen in the persistence of regional identity. Even after the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, Galicia retained a sense of distinctiveness. Later sources still referred to the region in ways that echoed its earlier history, linking it to the Suevic past. At the same time, the scarcity of evidence makes it difficult to trace this continuity in detail. Much of what followed is obscured by the limited nature of the surviving records, and the transformations brought about by subsequent political and social changes. In the middle of the 5th century, during the rule of Recchia, the Suevic kingdom reached a moment of extraordinary power. He inherited a strong and expanding realm from his father Recchia, whose authority had already taken firm hold over Galicia and extended influence deep into the Iberian Peninsula. By the time Recchia came to power, the Sueves were no longer a marginal group. They were becoming one of the dominant forces in Hispania. Recchia quickly reinforced his position through diplomacy as much as through warfare. His marriage into the family of Theodoric I connected him directly to the Visigothic court in Toulouse, creating a powerful alliance. Unlike many rulers of Germanic origin, he embraced Catholic Christianity, which brought him closer to the Hispano-Roman population and strengthened his legitimacy. This religious alignment also improved his standing with the imperial court, allowing him to present himself as a ruler who belonged to the same cultural and political world as Rome. By the early 450s, Recchia had secured recognition from the imperial authorities in Italy. This gave him confidence to act boldly. He launched campaigns into territories that still remained under Roman control, including regions such as Carthaginiensis and eventually Tarraconensis. These actions were not random raids but calculated moves, taking advantage of the instability that followed the deaths of powerful Roman leaders. With the collapse of central authority, opportunities opened across the peninsula, and the Sueves were ready to seize them. Despite these achievements, many historians have treated the rise of the Suevic kingdom as something temporary or accidental. According to this view, the Sueves were always limited by their position in the far northwest of Hispania. Their homeland, Galicia, was seen as distant and lacking the economic strength of other regions. Compared to the Vandals, who would later control North Africa, or the Visigoths, who built a structured kingdom, the Sueves have often been portrayed as secondary players. However, this interpretation overlooks the broader reality of the time. The expansion of Suevic power did not happen in isolation. It was closely linked to larger changes across the Western Roman world. When the Vandals left Hispania and moved toward Africa, they left behind a power vacuum. At the same time, the Roman Empire itself was weakening, struggling to maintain control over its provinces. Agreements between Rome and other barbarian groups, such as the Visigoths, created a new political landscape in which regional powers like the Sueves could act more freely. Recchia had already taken advantage of these conditions by capturing key cities such as Merida and Seville. These were not just symbolic victories. They were economic and strategic centres, controlling trade routes and communication lines. When Recchia continued this policy, he was building on a foundation that had already transformed the Suevic kingdom into a serious political force. Far from being isolated, the Sueves were deeply connected to the wider world. Through their alliance with the Visigoths, they were indirectly linked to the imperial court. Their actions were recognized and taken seriously across the Western Mediterranean. Evidence from archaeology and coinage suggests that their influence was both political and economic, extending beyond their original base in Galicia. To understand their rise, it is necessary to look even further back. The movements of barbarian groups into the Roman Empire at the beginning of the 5th century were not simply chaotic invasions. They were often tied to internal Roman conflicts. Rival factions within the empire sometimes encouraged these groups to cross borders in order to weaken their enemies. In this environment, alliances shifted rapidly and opportunities appeared for ambitious leaders. The Sueves were one such group that adapted quickly. Their early leaders recognized that survival depended on choosing the right allies. At first, they were connected with the Vandals, but this relationship did not last. Instead, they aligned themselves with the Visigoths, who were better positioned within the Roman political system. This decision proved crucial. It allowed the Sueves to gain recognition and establish a stable base of power. Meanwhile, other groups such as the Alans and Vandals also played important roles in Hispania. When the peninsula was divided among them, each group received territories that had strategic value. Control over agricultural regions, trade routes, and coastal access was essential. The Vandals, for example, divided their forces to dominate both southern Spain and parts of the northwest, ensuring access to key economic zones. The importance of the Atlantic coast during this period is often underestimated. While the Mediterranean remained central to the Roman world, the Atlantic routes were vital for transporting goods, especially between Hispania, Gaul, and Britain. Cities like Braga and Seville became important hubs within this network. Whoever controlled these locations could influence trade and supply lines across a wide area. The Sueves understood this well. Their expansion was not random but focused on linking these strategic centres. By controlling both the northwest and the south, they created a corridor of power that connected different parts of the peninsula. This gave them both economic strength and political influence. The turning point came when the Sueves fully established themselves in Galicia after defeating their rivals. From this moment, their kingdom was no longer just a temporary settlement. It became an organised political entity, with a royal centre and a clear structure. Braga emerged as the heart of their rule, replacing earlier centres of power. Their alliance with the Visigoths was essential in this transformation. It provided legitimacy and protection at a time when the Roman Empire could no longer enforce its authority. The Suevic kings were no longer just leaders of a migrating group. They had become rulers of a defined territory, recognised by both allies and rivals. Yet this success also brought new challenges. As the Sueves grew stronger, their interests began to conflict with those of their former allies. Control over southern Hispania, especially cities like Seville, became a point of tension. Attempts by Roman and Visigothic forces to intervene show how important these regions had become. In the centuries that followed the collapse of Roman authority in the far west, the land of Galicia did not simply fall into silence. Instead, it became the setting for a deep transformation, where power, belief, and identity were reshaped together. The Christian Church, once closely tied to the structures of the Roman Empire, gradually adapted to a new political reality. As imperial rule faded, the Church did not disappear. It evolved. It became the religious backbone of a new kingdom, ruled by the Sueves, a Germanic people who had settled in the region and begun to build their own authority. At the centre of this transformation stood the bishops. They were no longer only religious leaders. In many places, they took on roles once held by Roman officials and local aristocrats. They acted as judges, negotiators, and representatives of their communities. Their influence reached far beyond the walls of churches. Because of this, Suevic rulers quickly understood their importance. Controlling territory was one thing, but gaining the support of the local population required cooperation with these powerful figures. Over time, a working relationship developed. At first, it was cautious and sometimes hostile, but gradually it turned into a partnership that helped stabilize the region. This cooperation shaped the political future of the Suevic Kingdom. The rulers provided military strength, while the bishops offered legitimacy and continuity. Together, they maintained order in a land where Roman administration had once dominated. In this environment, a new kind of kingdom emerged. It was not purely barbarian, nor entirely Roman. It was something in between, a hybrid system where old traditions and new realities merged. Religion played a key role in this process. When the Sueves first arrived, they followed their own traditional beliefs, and the church made little effort to convert them. For a time, different religions existed side by side with little interference. The Christian population continued its practices. Churches remained active, and religious life carried on even under foreign rule. Conflicts did occur, but they were usually tied to war and plunder rather than faith itself. The turning point came with the conversion of the Suevic king Recchia. His adoption of Catholic Christianity was a bold move. It set him apart from other Germanic rulers, many of whom followed different versions of Christianity, or remained outside the faith altogether. This decision was not only spiritual, it carried political weight. By embracing the religion of the local population, the king strengthened his position and gained support among Hispano-Roman elites and church leaders. However, this first attempt at religious unity did not immediately succeed. Not all Sueves accepted the change, and not all Roman inhabitants trusted it. The kingdom remained divided for a time, and internal conflicts weakened its stability. Outside forces also played a role. The Visigoths, another powerful group in the region, intervened and influenced Suevic politics, even introducing their own religious ideas to shape alliances and control. Despite these challenges, the process of integration continued. Over the following decades, the boundaries between Sueves and Hispano-Romans became less rigid. Intermarriage, shared institutions, and religious interaction brought the two groups closer together. Eventually, a more unified identity began to take shape. By the middle of the 6th century, this transformation reached its peak. The Suevic Kingdom fully embraced Catholic Christianity, aligning itself with the dominant religious tradition of the region. This shift was not sudden. It was the result of long cooperation between rulers and church leaders, especially figures like Martin of Braga, who helped organize the church and guide the moral and political direction of the kingdom. With this change, the kingdom gained a new level of cohesion. The church became a central force in governance, education, and social life. Kings supported councils, promoted religious unity, and worked closely with bishops to strengthen their rule. At the same time, the church expanded its structure, creating new dioceses and reinforcing its authority across the territory. Yet this unity was never complete. Different beliefs continued to exist, sometimes in tension with one another. Movements like Priscillianism, which offered alternative interpretations of Christianity, remained influential in certain areas. These internal divisions forced church leaders to defend their authority and define orthodoxy more clearly. Priscillianism was not truly brought under control until the later 6th century. Its final decline came only after the Suevic Kingdom embraced Catholicism, and the Church gained the political backing it had long needed. Once the Sueves converted, the church councils held at Braga turned their attention directly to the problem. The bishops were deeply concerned by the weak religious education of many clergy and by the survival of practices they considered dangerous or heretical. At the First Council of Braga in 561, they introduced strict measures designed to stamp out Priscillianist customs and punish anyone who ignored church rulings or allowed the sect to continue unchecked. One example reveals how seriously they took the matter. Because Priscillianists were known for refusing meat, clergy were required either to eat it or at least taste vegetables prepared with meat. Any cleric who refused could be disciplined and removed from office, yet the campaign went beyond a few isolated customs. The bishops were trying to bring order to a church that had become uneven in doctrine, ritual, and discipline, especially in remote areas where many churchmen barely knew what proper practice was supposed to be. To correct this disorder, church leaders sought outside guidance and then imposed internal reform. Bishop Profuturus consulted Pope Vigilius, and the councils of Braga moved to establish uniform rules across the Suevic Church. At the first council, the assembled bishops formally received and approved both the Pope's letter and a profession of faith directed against Priscillianist belief. A few years later, at the Second Council of Braga in 572, Martin of Braga adapted material from Eastern Church councils for use in the Suevic Kingdom. Across these assemblies, the bishops addressed a wide range of issues. They regulated the order and liturgical use of the psalms, clarified proper baptismal practice, established rules for the Mass, defined how clergy should greet the congregation, and fixed observance of Easter. They also legislated on clerical clothing, conduct, and duties, along with salaries, church income, and the management of ecclesiastical property. These were not minor corrections. They were part of a broad attempt to reshape the Church into a disciplined and unified institution. It is no accident that Priscillianism faded only after the Suevic Kingdom became officially Catholic, and the monarchy threw its weight behind the Church. Religious dissent was far easier to suppress once bishops could rely on royal support. That alliance mattered in another way as well. Churchmen and kings worked closely together in the wider reorganization of the kingdom. This included territorial restructuring, the division between the provinces of Lugo and Braga, and the creation of a parish network later preserved in the Parochiale Suevum. The kings provided the clergy with political protection, authority, and material resources. With that support, church leaders were able to confront the ideological and doctrinal divisions that threatened unity. The councils of Braga were themselves held under royal authority. King Ariamir stood behind the first council and King Miro behind the second. At the same time, impressive religious buildings were constructed or renewed, including churches dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours. Christianity was becoming inseparable from the government of the kingdom and from the daily conduct of its people, while bishops increasingly served the kings not only as spiritual leaders, but as advisors and counselors. No figure was more important in this transformation than Martin of Braga. He was not native to the kingdom, yet he became the central architect of the reformed Suevic Church. As Metropolitan Bishop of Braga, he recognized the Church's most urgent weaknesses and set out to address them. He fought pagan customs and religious deviance, but he did so through organization, teaching, and pastoral clarity as much as through condemnation. He supplied the Church with rules that created greater consistency in doctrine, liturgy, and practice, and he also founded a monastic community at Doom. Martin understood that many people remained attached to old rites, local superstitions, and inherited beliefs not because of deliberate hostility to Christianity, but because the Christian faith had often taken root only shallowly in the countryside. In his view, ignorance was the main enemy. For that reason, he treated instruction as the most effective weapon against paganism and superstition. He composed a simple pastoral sermon aimed at rural people, explaining in clear language the foundations of Christian belief and the harmful nature of old pagan rituals and magical practices. He warned of the spiritual danger of remaining in error, yet his tone was not merely harsh. He also stressed divine mercy and the possibility of forgiveness for those who repented. This balance is important. Martin did not present himself only as a judge of popular custom, but as a teacher trying to bring poorly instructed communities into a more fully Christian life. That approach distinguished him from more aggressive missionary models and helped shape the lasting moral and religious culture of the region. By the eve of the Visigothic conquest in 585, the combined efforts of the Catholic bishops, the Suevic monarchy, and above all Martin of Braga, had fundamentally reshaped the church within the kingdom. The establishment of a second metropolitan see at Lugo, the reorganisation of dioceses, and the development of a mapped parish structure gave the Church of Galicia a stronger territorial framework that may also have reflected civil administration. Internal sectarian division had been reduced, and the Church pursued greater unity of practice through the rulings of the councils of Braga and Martin's work of collecting and adapting canons from other Christian traditions. His moral, pastoral, and monastic writings reveal not a provincial church cut off from the wider world, but an intellectually alive and spiritually vigorous institution whose influence would continue long after the fall of the Suevic Kingdom. After the Visigothic king Leovigild annexed the Suevic Kingdom in 585, the historical trail in Galicia becomes much thinner. Written evidence survives only in scattered form, and the material record still leaves much to be explored. A few ecclesiastical works remain, including the life of Fructuosus and related monastic rules, the autobiographical writings and other texts of Valerius of Bierzo, the canons of the Third Council of Braga, held in 675, and the acts of later church councils in Toledo, attended by Galician bishops. There are also traces from local mints and occasional glimpses of how administration functioned under Visigothic rule. But compared with other regions, the evidence is sparse. Because of that, earlier generations of Spanish historians often passed over Galicia quickly. Those drawn to the Visigothic kingdom as an early symbol of religious and political unity in Iberia had little reason to linger on a peripheral region absorbed into the realm of Toledo. At the same time, many Galician historians preferred to celebrate older local traditions such as the Castro world or the Suevic monarchy as signs of distinct identity rather than focus on a period of subjection to outside rule. Everything changed after the Muslim invasion of 711 and the collapse of the Visigothic kingdom. During the next 3 centuries, Galicia emerged as one of the most important and dynamic parts of the Astur-Leonese realm. The broad outline of the kingdom's political history was recorded by court chroniclers, writing under Alfonso III, and by later authors such as the Leonese cleric Sampiro. But the real richness of the period appears above all in the charters that multiplied during the 10th century. These documents, through their language, structure, and content, open a window onto a society marked by dense settlement, varied economic life, clearly articulated social relationships, strong religious culture, and a remarkably literate environment. Scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, monastic rules, church law, and Visigothic civil tradition all remained active forces in this world. Place names, surviving documents, and the modest remains of early churches now offer valuable clues for future archaeological study. Even so, the Astur-Leonese kingdom has long received limited attention in international scholarship, and Galicia even less. General surveys in English have often given it little space. When the kingdom does appear, the focus usually falls on dynasties, warfare, and royal politics. That emphasis has shaped the treatment of the sources as well. The brief Asturian chronicles were edited, translated, and widely used, while the large and often elaborate body of charter evidence remained neglected for many years. Earlier, scholars had cast suspicion on these texts, and ideological battles surrounding medieval Spanish history only deepened that hesitation. As a result, a vast body of evidence capable of revealing social, legal, religious, and economic life remained underused. Modern scholarship gradually changed that picture. Mid-20th century debates often revolved around large questions. Whether the rulers of the Northern Kingdom were Gothic, Neo-Gothic, or fundamentally indigenous in character. Whether settlement patterns represented continuity or rupture, and whether the so-called Reconquest provided the proper framework for understanding the age. Galicia did enter these debates, and some historians used its charters to reconstruct noble families, political structures, and ecclesiastical developments. Still, such work rarely reached far beyond Spanish-language scholarship. For English-speaking readers, early medieval Galicia remained obscure. That began to change in the later 20th century. Important studies of figures like Diego Gelmírez offered broader sketches of Galicia's early medieval background and highlighted the beginnings of the cult of St. James. Over time, however, the decisive shift came through the recovery and publication of monastic, cartularies, and local documentary collections. Once archives, such as those of Samos, Lorenza, Santiago Cathedral, Xelanova, and other institutions became more accessible, the field was transformed. At the same time, the renewal of regional identity after the death of Franco encouraged a new generation of scholars to engage deeply with Galicia's own past. They used charters more confidently and more creatively, exploring monasteries, settlement, territorial organization, social structure, aristocratic power, and local institutions. This work, supported by a flood of new editions and regional studies across northern Iberia, has given a much fuller picture of the early medieval Northwest. Despite these advances, Galicia is still often treated as marginal within broader Spanish narratives. The Astur-Leonese kingdom, once widely known as the Kingdom of Galicia in some contexts, later came to be framed as the cradle of Spanish unity, a view that pushed Galicia into the background. The later political separation between Galicia and Portugal also discouraged historians from approaching the lands on both sides of the Minho River as a connected historical zone. Because of that, Galicia's early medieval past has too often been reduced to local history, cut off from wider conversations about European development. Yet that view is increasingly hard to sustain. The cult of St. James has always drawn international attention, and new studies of early texts, church organisation, settlement patterns, and archaeology have shown that Galicia belongs in broader discussions of medieval Europe. Collaborative research over the past decades has brought fresh attention to questions of political space, local communities, conflict resolution, aristocratic power, and written culture in the Northwest. Seen in that wider light, Galicia is not a remote fringe of someone else's kingdom. It was a vital region within the Astur-Leonese realm and an essential bridge between late antiquity and the central Middle Ages. Its charters are not dry administrative leftovers, but rich historical sources that reveal aristocratic ambition, monastic culture, legal thought, and social negotiation. They also show how deeply the legacies of the Suevic and Visigothic churches endured, how monastic traditions linked back to figures such as Martin of Braga and Fructuosus, and how written law continued to shape dispute settlement and property relations. Galicia offers a powerful case for rethinking the cultural and institutional inheritance of late antiquity beyond the better-known centres of Carolingian Europe. Its early medieval history also sheds light on a broader question. How did societies remain cohesive and culturally productive in regions where central authority was often weak or uneven? Galicia provides one answer. Here, local elites, churches, monasteries, and written traditions worked together and against one another in complex ways. The region's experience encourages comparison not only with neighbouring Iberian lands, but with other parts of Europe lying on the margins of powerful political centres, from the British Isles to southern Italy. Far from being a historical dead end, early medieval Galicia offers a fresh perspective on the formation of medieval society itself. One of the clearest ways to see this is through the relationship between aristocracy and monarchy in the northwest between the 8th and 11th centuries. Historians have long recognised the power of lay and ecclesiastical elites in medieval Galicia, but their roots go back much earlier than the Great Age of Compostela. Their authority was built gradually through family inheritance, political office, ties to kings, and the occupation and settlement of territories won in expansion to the south. To understand these elites, it is necessary to return to the period after the Muslim invasion, when the old Visigothic kingdom had collapsed and a new political order was forming in the far north. Recent scholarship has increasingly emphasised that the Muslim conquest did not produce the same kind of rupture everywhere in Iberia. In many places, local society continued with less immediate change than older narratives once assumed. This was especially true in the far north and northwest. Arab control in these areas weakened sharply after the Berber revolt of 740 and 741, which forced a withdrawal from much of the northern plateau and left space for the growth of the Kingdom of the Astures. This polity began in the narrow land between the Cantabrian Mountains and the sea and slowly extended its reach outward. Later, sources insisted that this northern kingdom was the rightful heir of the Visigoths. That claim was useful. It gave legitimacy to rulers who wanted to present their expansion not as conquest, but as restoration. It also appealed to Christians who had moved north from Muslim-held territories, and who hoped for the recovery of the old order. Yet the earliest evidence suggests that this neo-Gothic identity was not present from the beginning. The Kingdom of the Astures appears instead as a new political formation that emerged in the aftermath of Visigothic collapse. Its ruling groups came from populations that had once lived within the Roman world of the far north. These were not untouched tribal remnants from an earlier age, but communities shaped by the long influence of Roman culture, with their own local elites and ambitions. That matters because the expansion of the Asturian kingdom into places like Galicia should not simply be described as the suppression of rebellion. The chronicles call Galicians and Basques rebels rising against legitimate rule, but that language was a political tool. It suggested that these territories were already subject to Asturian authority, and that military action was merely the restoration of order. In reality, what took place was conquest and incorporation. Galicia was not a province returning to obedience, it was a region being brought under a new power. The same sources that speak of rebellion also reveal that the process involved annexation, settlement, and the extension of political control over new lands. Once that process is understood as expansion, the role of regional elites becomes much clearer. The labels Galicians or Basques can hide the fact that these societies were led by local and regional aristocracies who resisted the new kingdom and later negotiated their place within it. For crucial decades, the rulers of the Astures were occupied less with fighting Muslims than with asserting their authority over neighbouring Christian regions. In time, that effort largely succeeded. By the mid-9th century, aristocratic groups based in Galicia had already become important players in the kingdom's internal politics. Ramiro I, for example, was able to gather support in Lugo and use it to fight for the throne in Oviedo. That could only happen in a world where Galician elites were already integrated into the political life of the kingdom and could use that connection to pursue their own ambitions. The expansion southward in the second half of the 9th century transformed this aristocracy. As the Emirate of Córdoba struggled with its own difficulties, the kingdom of the Astures and its regional elites were able to advance into territories where Muslim control had weakened. These campaigns were not driven solely from the royal court. Local aristocrats took the initiative and stood to gain the most. When Vimara Pérez occupied Oporto in 868, for example, the monarchy itself was unstable, and royal authority was hardly secure. That suggests that Western aristocrats were acting from their own interests as much as from loyalty to the king. The conquest of such places gave them access to richer lands, denser populations, and more productive settlements than those available in the harsher territories of the north. This new wealth laid the foundations for the great aristocratic houses that dominated the following century. Such families also built their legitimacy through memory and ancestry. Some linked themselves to prestigious Visigothic lines, using the past to raise their standing over rivals. Others strengthened their position through ties to the ruling family of Oviedo. Marriage was one of the key tools in this process. Kings married their sons into powerful regional families, and those alliances served both sides. The monarchy secured support in distant territories, while aristocratic families gained prestige, protection, and access to office. Through these relationships, the crown could elevate certain local powers over others, rewarding those who backed royal authority and punishing those who resisted it. Those who stood close to the monarchy were given titles, offices, and lands, especially in newly conquered regions. Those who opposed it could be crushed, dispossessed, or excluded from political memory. Some leading figures of the Great Southern Expansion later disappear from official lists of counts, while their territories are assigned to loyal rivals. This was not random. It reflects the way the monarchy used conquest, ideology, and patronage together. By presenting itself as the restorer of rightful rule, and by confiscating the lands of rebels, it could strengthen allies who would then uphold royal interests in the regions. In this way, the bond between monarchy and aristocracy became one of the central engines of power in the northwest. The crown relied on selected families to enforce order, suppress rivals, and extend influence. Those families, in turn, built up lasting regional dominance through their connection to the king. Over time, this created a powerful but still distinctly regional aristocracy. These nobles were not a unified kingdom-wide elite. Their roots, offices, and interests remained tied above all to the western lands of Galicia and Portugal, and it was there that their influence was strongest. The pattern continued into the 10th century. Royal succession practices often tied princes to different parts of the kingdom before they inherited the throne, and that encouraged them to build alliances with the magnates of those regions. Marriage again played a crucial role. Princes and kings were linked by blood and marriage to aristocratic networks, whose support they needed. Through these ties, regional nobles secured royal favour, lands, and titles, while the monarchy obtained crucial backing in unstable times. Yet aristocratic power also depended on more than royal friendship. These families managed large inherited estates, expanded them through war, grants, and marriage, and defended them across generations with careful attention to property division and family cohesion. Their wealth could be immense. Estates stretched across multiple regions. Livestock holdings were enormous. Lands included villages, monasteries, castles, and dependent families. Some of this property came from inheritance, but much of it came from booty, royal generosity, and gains won through conquest or legal pressure. Aristocrats could also increase their wealth by drawing peasants into relations of dependence, collecting dues, imposing fines, or absorbing the lands of those unable to repay debts. Economic power and political authority reinforced one another constantly. Yet this world was fragile. From the mid-10th century onward, the Caliphate of Cordoba became militarily dominant, and opportunities for further expansion declined. Booty and new land grew scarcer. In such conditions, aristocratic competition sharpened. Some nobles entered Muslim service as mercenaries. Others challenged the crown more openly. The monarchy, more centred on Leon, struggled to maintain authority in both Castile and Galicia. Rebellions became more frequent, and noble titles increasingly remained in particular families, rather than circulating freely at the king's will. Even when royal power stripped a lineage of lands or offices, those families could often recover their position once political conditions shifted again. At the same time, aristocratic pressure increasingly fell on ecclesiastical institutions. Great families had founded monasteries such as Sobrado, Celanova, and Guimarães, endowing them richly and making them centres of religious life, family memory, burial, and patronage. But later generations often looked at those same monastic estates as wealth that had once belonged to their own ancestors and ought, in hard times, to help sustain the family again. Monasteries protested these intrusions in their documents, yet, from the aristocratic point of view, such claims may have seemed entirely justified. The result was a growing tension between noble families and church institutions, one that would shape the politics of the late 10th and early 11th centuries. In the early 10th century, around the year 902, a cleric named Theodanandus made his way from the lands of Galicia to the royal court of Alfonso III. Standing before the king, he presented not simply a request, but a story, one that reached back more than a century into the past. He spoke of his great-grandfather, a man who had fled from Muslim-controlled territories and settled in the northwest. This ancestor had taken possession of several rural estates, including an abandoned settlement near the Saria River. There, he established a small religious foundation, building a church and setting aside sacred ground to serve both the clergy and the dead who would be buried there. Over time, however, the order that once defined this place began to unravel. The original charter that had defined its rights and structure was said to have been lost. Without it, discipline weakened. The community no longer followed a shared rule. Its resources were misused, and its members drifted away from a stable religious life. Some wandered without direction, abandoning the structure that had once given meaning to their existence. What had begun as a carefully organised foundation slowly fell into neglect. Determined to reverse this decline, Theodanandus sought royal backing to rebuild what had been lost. With the king's approval, he restored the church and reorganised its life. New buildings were constructed, a cloister was established, and the surrounding lands were replenished with orchards, livestock, and working structures. Just as important, he imposed a clear hierarchy. Anyone living within this religious space would answer to a recognised leader, ensuring that the failures of the past would not be repeated. His family too would play a role, guaranteeing the protection and continuity of the foundation. This entire account survives in a highly elaborate document, preserved centuries later in the records of a nearby monastery. The language of this text is rich and carefully shaped, presenting the story in a way that emphasizes both moral purpose and historical depth. Yet the fate of Theodanandus's own foundation stands in stark contrast to the grandeur of its description. Despite his efforts, the community he restored did not endure in the long term. Its memory faded, overshadowed by the rise of more successful institutions in the region. One of those institutions would grow into a dominant religious centre, accumulating churches, lands, and authority over a wide territory. Its archive preserves hundreds of documents, offering glimpses into the religious and social world of early medieval Galicia. Through these records, it becomes clear that many smaller communities, like that of Theodanandus, existed, each struggling to survive in a landscape marked by change, instability, and competition for resources. The broader setting reveals a pattern. After earlier disruptions, religious life in the region was repeatedly rebuilt, often with the support of rulers. New groups arrived, older traditions were revived, and monastic networks expanded. Leaders attempted to organize clergy, oversee religious practice, and connect scattered communities into larger systems. Yet these efforts were fragile. Political conflicts, shifting alliances, and internal weaknesses frequently disrupted even the most promising foundations. The restoration associated with Theodanandus fits into this larger story. It reflects both ambition and uncertainty. His work shows how individuals sought to impose order, revive discipline, and create lasting institutions. At the same time, the eventual disappearance of his foundation reveals how difficult it was to sustain these efforts over generations. The document itself carries significance beyond the events it describes. Its language draws from a wide range of intellectual traditions, blending scriptural ideas, inherited teachings, and established religious concepts into a single narrative. It presents the act of rebuilding not just as a practical task, but as a moral and spiritual achievement. Through this, it offers a glimpse into the mindset of those who shaped religious life at the time. Later generations would reuse and adapt elements of such texts, sometimes copying them directly, sometimes reshaping them to fit new circumstances. In doing so, they created a chain of continuity that connected different institutions and periods. At times, this process even led to the creation of documents that imitated earlier models, blurring the line between original records and later constructions. Because of this, the story preserved in Theodanandus's charter is not only about one foundation. It reflects a wider world in which memory, authority, and written tradition were constantly being reshaped. It shows how communities tried to define themselves, how they justified their existence, and how they struggled to survive in a changing landscape. In the late 20th century, Pierre Bonacieux put forward a bold idea about the medieval lands of Christian Spain and the Western Mediterranean. He argued that regions which later historians often studied separately had, in fact, passed through broadly similar developments during the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. In his view, the lands of northern Iberia and southern France were connected by more than geography. They shared ways of life, legal traditions, and social structures that made comparison not only possible, but necessary. He was especially frustrated by the intellectual divide between scholars working on the French south and those focused on the Iberian world. That separation, he believed, had hidden a much larger historical pattern. At the centre of his argument stood Catalonia. Bonacieux described it as a society where older legal and political traditions remained strong well into the 10th century. He saw a world in which written Visigothic law still carried real authority, where public institutions retained substance, and where a large body of free peasants continued to cultivate their own land. In his reconstruction, this older order did not simply fade away little by little. Instead, it broke apart dramatically during the first half of the 11th century. Public justice gave way to private coercion. Local lords expanded their power through force. Social relations hardened. What emerged, in his telling, was a new feudal society shaped by violence, fragmentation, and seigneurial domination. What made this interpretation especially influential was that it did not remain limited to Catalonia. Bonacieux believed that the same broad pattern could be traced across a much wider zone, stretching from the Rhone Valley to Galicia. Catalonia, in that sense, was not an exception but a particularly well-documented example of a larger transformation. Some later historians pushed this argument even further, and treated the Catalan experience as a model for understanding medieval change across much of Europe. The feudal revolution became, for a time, one of the most powerful explanations for the social and political upheavals of the 11th century. Over time, however, this model came under heavy criticism. From the 1990s onward, many historians began to question both the speed and the scale of the transformation Bonassi described. Some argued that the language of feudalization was too vague or too loaded to be analytically useful. Others pointed out that medieval records often speak of violence in stylized ways, and that complaints preserved in charters do not always prove a society was collapsing into disorder. There was also growing skepticism about the idea that changes in the form of written records automatically reflected a total restructuring of society. Perhaps most importantly, scholars began to doubt the sharp contrast between public and private power that Bonassi had treated as fundamental. That distinction, so central to the theory, often proved much harder to sustain when tested against the surviving evidence. Yet while the feudal revolution itself has been challenged again and again, another part of Bonassi's vision has remained deeply valuable. He urged historians to look across regions instead of sealing them off from one another. That comparative instinct was one of the strongest aspects of his work, even if the larger model attached to it now seems too rigid. The problem is that many scholars accepted the language of broad transformation without really embracing the comparative method that made Bonassi's original proposal so promising. Historians often continue to work within narrow regional frames, concentrating on Galicia, Leon, Catalonia, Tuscany, or Picardy, as if each were a separate world. Even when they borrowed the chronology of change from Catalonia and applied it elsewhere, they rarely stopped to test closely how institutions, customs, and legal habits actually functioned from one region to another. A more fruitful approach begins on a smaller scale. Instead of asking whether a region fits neatly into a grand theory, it is often more revealing to ask how particular practices operated in daily life. One especially useful point of entry is the way communities handled disputes. Looking at legal practice does not provide a complete picture of medieval society, but it does reveal how power worked, how people defended property, how authority was recognized, and how conflict was managed in periods that were politically fragmented. It also helps test whether written law was always tied to strong public institutions in the way Bonassi suggested. Any comparison of this kind must begin with the sources themselves. That is crucial because medieval documents do not simply describe legal procedures from a distance. They were part of those procedures. Charters recording donations, sales, settlements, and judicial decisions were not passive records. They were tools used to create, defend, and legitimize rights over land and resources. In many cases, the document was not just evidence after the fact. It was one of the instruments through which a claim was made effective. This makes the sources both valuable and difficult. They open a window onto legal culture, but they also shaped the very world they appear to describe. For the 10th and 11th centuries, both Galicia and Catalonia are rich in documentary evidence when compared to many other parts of Europe. That common reliance on charters makes comparison possible. Throughout the Christian lands of northern Spain and southern France, the most common surviving texts are documents relating to property, especially transactions involving monasteries, churches, and lay landholders. Since narrative sources are sparse, these records must carry a great weight. Historians use them not only to study legal disputes, but also to reconstruct political authority, social structure, economic life, agricultural practice, and even mental habits. Their value lies partly in their abundance, and partly in the fact that similar kinds of records survive across wide stretches of Europe. At the same time, the evidence from Galicia and Catalonia is not equal in quantity or character. Catalonia preserves thousands of original charters from the period. Galicia preserves far fewer originals and depends much more heavily on later cartulary copies. That difference matters a great deal. An original parchment can reveal far more than the wording of the text. It can show how different individuals signed, how literacy varied, how symbols were used, and how a document was physically organized. A copy made generations later smooths away much of that texture. Cartulary compilers selected what they considered worth preserving, and they often regularized language and form in the process. As a result, Galicia's legal culture is harder to observe at close range, not necessarily because it was less developed, but because the surviving materials are less immediate. There is another problem as well. In the middle decades of the 11th century, Galician documentation thins out sharply, while Catalonia's surviving evidence becomes more plentiful and more varied. That contrast invites interpretation, but it does not yield easy answers. A gap in documentation might reflect political instability, or a shift in archival habits, or simple accidents of preservation. It might indicate a real breakdown in legal order, or it might not. The silence of the sources can be suggestive, but it is never transparent. Most of what is known about legal practice in Galicia comes from a handful of major ecclesiastical cartularies, especially those connected to Santiago de Compostela, Celanova, Sobrado, Lugo, Samos, and nearby Portuguese centres such as Braga. These collections preserve a wide range of disputes, settlements, and property transactions. As elsewhere in Latin Europe, the clearest evidence for legal procedure comes from litigation. Some records describe formal assemblies, presided over by kings, counts, or bishops. Others preserve settlements that emerged from more local and less formal negotiations. Some are detailed, almost narrative in style. Others record only the bare result. Most disputes concern property. Churches and monasteries frequently clashed with lay families over vineyards, pastures, mills, fish ponds, fields, or villages. This was true in Galicia just as it was in Catalonia. Yet Galicia's documentation also shows some striking features of its own. One is the relative prominence of disputes involving personal status. In a number of cases, people resisted attempts to classify them as unfree or subordinate to a particular ecclesiastical lord. These conflicts were not only about land, but also about social position and dependence. Another distinctive feature is the number of cases involving actions that modern readers would think of as criminal. Some donations were made as compensation for theft, adultery, or homicide. In these cases, property changed hands not simply because of a sale or pious gift, but because wrongdoing had to be repaired. Such records do exist elsewhere, but in Galicia they appear with unusual frequency. Boundary disputes were also common. Some were politically important, involving diocesan or territorial limits, and the claims of powerful ecclesiastical or lay authorities. Others were much more local, concerning the exact line between neighbouring estates. In these smaller cases, communities often relied on practical knowledge embedded in the landscape itself. Hills, streams, roads, rocks, and old markers all served as reference points. The settlement of such disputes often required physical inspection on the ground, not just verbal argument in an assembly. Across the lands from Galicia to the Rhone, one of the strongest unifying features was the continued prestige of the old Visigothic law code. Judges, scribes, and litigants treated it as an important source of authority. They invoked it when preparing wills, confirming the transferability of property, evaluating proofs, and strengthening the legitimacy of judicial acts. In both Galicia and Catalonia, the code remained present as a legal touchstone long after the end of Visigothic political rule. Its authority still mattered around the year 1000. which in the broader European context is itself a remarkable fact. But the code was never applied in a complete or systematic way. It contained an enormous body of legislation, covering everything from governance and inheritance to crime and legal procedure. Medieval courts did not use it as a total legal manual. Instead, they drew on selected parts of it for very specific purposes. Rules about inheritance, alienation of land, proof, and judicial authority appear repeatedly. Other sections were ignored. A case might involve theft or adultery without any direct appeal to the code's treatment of those acts. The law code was therefore both practical and symbolic. It was a usable reservoir of rules, but also an emblem of legitimacy and order. Another sign of continuity with older legal traditions was the survival of officials known as saiones. These figures appear in both Galician and Catalan records, performing various tasks connected to justice. They could gather witness testimony, supervise procedures, and help enforce judgments. Their presence reminds us that legal action was not entirely improvised, even in a world without large bureaucratic states. Some roles persisted, adapted, and continued to function within new political settings. When disputes came before an assembly, litigants were expected to prove their claims. In Galicia, as in much of Europe, the most important forms of proof were written documents and witness testimony. Charters could be produced to support an inherited claim, establish earlier possession, or clarify the location of a boundary. At the same time, witnesses were often just as important, and in Galicia, sometimes even more so. In certain cases, each side produced large numbers of supporters. These witnesses do not always seem to have been chosen because of precise knowledge about a specific transaction. Often, they appear instead as a collective backing for a claim, a public demonstration that one side had broad support in the community. This marks an important contrast with Catalonia. There, written documentation seems to have played a larger role, and witnesses more often appear in smaller numbers, giving testimony tied to particular events or acts. In Galicia, the picture is less exact. A party might appear with dozens of witnesses, or even hundreds, and the testimony itself may be described only in the vaguest terms. In such settings, witness lists could function partly as social pressure. They showed strength, credibility, and influence as much as memory. That does not mean the process lacked legal meaning. It means legal meaning was inseparable from communal standing. Courts in Galicia also sometimes carried out local investigations. Community members were asked about boundaries, previous agreements, or long-standing usage. These inquiries could be highly practical and detailed, but they could also fail. At times, no one could remember enough, or at least no one who was questioned could provide testimony strong enough to settle the matter cleanly. In some disputes, written records and oral testimony were used together. This combination was common across the broader region, but here again the balance varied. Catalonia leaned more heavily toward documentary proof, while Galicia often depended more visibly on oral support and local recollection. Judicial ordeals, so often imagined as central to medieval justice, appear only rarely. When they do show up, they are usually threatened rather than carried out. The proposal of an ordeal seems to have functioned more as a pressure tactic than as a routine legal mechanism. It could force a settlement, restart stalled negotiations, or compel a stubborn claimant to retreat. In both Galicia and Catalonia, ordeals belong to the margins of legal practice, not its centre. Many property disputes ended with the reaffirmation of boundaries. Assemblies moved through the landscape, identifying hills, streams, stones, roads, and other markers. Boundaries were remembered, checked, remarked, and written down. This physical engagement with the land was one of the most practical and durable aspects of medieval dispute resolution. It tied law to memory, memory to place, and place to written record. Through this process, communities could transform conflict into a new, collectively recognised settlement. That did not mean justice always worked smoothly. Some judgments were ignored or resisted. Even when a case had been heard, witnesses consulted, and a decision issued under recognised authority, one side might still refuse to comply. Medieval legal order was functional, but not absolute. It depended on persuasion, community pressure, negotiation, and sometimes force. Yet the overall picture that emerges from both Galicia and Catalonia is not one of total disorder. Political fragmentation did not automatically produce chaos. Communities had ways of addressing disputes, protecting rights, and restoring workable settlements. This is where comparison becomes especially valuable. When Galicia and Catalonia are set beside one another, common patterns become clear. Both regions relied on assemblies of varying formality. Both used witness testimony and written records. Both treated the Visigothic legal tradition as meaningful. Both handled many disputes through collective investigation of property boundaries. Both preserved traces of officers responsible for helping justice function. In both places, conflict was a normal part of social life, but it was not unmanaged. There existed practical methods for containing it. Yet the similarities should not be pushed too far. The same broad legal habits did not necessarily rest on the same social foundations. One of the clearest differences appears in the use of written law itself. In Catalonia, there is strong evidence for a body of trained legal professionals who studied the Visigothic code and built a distinctive legal culture around it. Judges there often appear as recognizable specialists, attached to comital or episcopal authority and active across multiple transactions. Some can be followed across decades as scribes, witnesses, and arbiters, and they explicitly highlighted the conformity of their work to written law. Galicia presents a different picture. Judges certainly existed, but they do not usually appear as members of a clearly professional legal class. Some were appointed by royal authority, but more often they seem to have been local notables gathered to settle a dispute because of their status, experience, or local knowledge. Their authority was less visibly tied to formal legal training. They could still invoke the Visigothic code, and scribes could still frame their decisions in its language, but the social setting of judgment was different. In Catalonia, legal expertise itself carried special weight. In Galicia, legal authority seems more often to have emerged from the collective standing of those involved. Even the deeper meaning of the same law code may have varied from one region to another. In both places, the Visigothic code retained prestige, but the roots of that prestige were not necessarily identical. In Galicia and Leon, attachment to Visigothic law seems closely tied to the memory of the Old Kingdom of Toledo and to the idea of restoring or continuing that legacy. The code was authoritative not only because it was useful, but because it connected the present to a powerful vision of the past. In Catalonia, the situation was different. There, political and ecclesiastical life developed under long Frankish influence, even while Visigothic legal traditions remained strong. The resulting culture was shaped by a fusion of inherited Iberian law and Frankish political forms. The same written law could therefore carry different historical resonances in different places. This matters because it shows why sweeping models are so often misleading. Legal forms, political authority, social hierarchy, violence, documentary habits, and concepts of lordship do not always move together in a single synchronized transformation. That is one of the central weaknesses of the feudal revolution as a total explanation. Its problem is not simply that it may exaggerate how sudden change was. Its deeper problem is that it binds together too many different developments and assumes they all point in the same direction at the same time. Closer comparison suggests a more uneven and less predictable reality. Galicia and Catalonia certainly shared important legal practices, but they did not follow the same path in every respect. Monastic life, systems of dependence, traditions of lordship, patterns of property holding, and the very role of writing differed in meaningful ways. Galicia preserved some religious and social traditions that faded earlier in Catalonia. The social meaning of servitude may not have developed in the same way in both regions. The contrast in surviving documentation alone suggests that writing occupied a different place in each society. Similar institutions can exist within different historical worlds. That is why Bonacieux's larger invitation still matters, even if the most famous part of his theory no longer convinces in its original form. The most productive way forward is neither to abandon comparison, nor to force every region into a single model. It is to compare patiently, at close range, and to allow both unity and diversity to appear together. The medieval lands between Galicia and the Rhone did share important structures, habits, and legal ideas. But they also preserved their own rhythms, their own balances between memory and writing, their own ways of grounding authority, and their own patterns of social change. Seen in that light, the period becomes more interesting, not less. Instead of a single continental collapse into feudal violence, a more complex landscape comes into view. Communities across the western Mediterranean and northern Iberia managed disputes through institutions that were flexible, local, and often effective. Written law remained meaningful, but not in identical ways everywhere. Political fragmentation did not erase order, and regional differences did not prevent broad cultural connections. The challenge is not to reduce this world to one formula, but to understand how deeply shared traditions could produce distinct outcomes in different settings. That broader perspective, which looks across regions without flattening them, opens the door to a richer understanding of medieval Iberia and its neighbouring lands. As more sources become accessible and cross-border, scholarship continues to grow. It becomes easier to trace both the patterns that linked these societies and the differences that gave each of them its character. The world from Galicia to the Rhone was not uniform, but neither was it a collection of sealed compartments. It was a connected zone of legal memory, local experimentation, and shifting power, and its complexity is precisely what makes it so worth studying. Galicia did not begin as a weak or marginal region. In the early medieval centuries, it was one of the strongest and most cohesive societies in the Iberian Peninsula. Long before it became part of larger kingdoms, it already had deep roots shaped by pre-Roman communities, Roman administration, and the legacy of the Suevic Kingdom. Its population was dense, its local elites were powerful, and its religious life was vibrant enough to attract Christians migrating from Muslim-controlled territories. This combination created a region that was not only stable, but highly organized, with functioning networks of communication and a diversified economy. Written records from the time reveal a society where monasteries, aristocratic families, and legal systems were closely intertwined, and where literacy played an important role in maintaining order and authority. For centuries, Galicia held a strong position within the Asturian kingdom. Its nobles were not passive subjects. They could support the kings or challenge them, depending on circumstances. Power was never absolute, and kings depended heavily on alliances with local elites. At the same time, Galicia gained enormous religious importance with the discovery of the tomb of St. James in Santiago de Compostela. This transformed the region into a major spiritual centre, drawing pilgrims from across Europe and placing it at the heart of a growing religious network. Despite this, some contemporary writers downplayed Galicia's importance, and later historians often followed this perspective, influenced by broader narratives focused on the formation of a unified Spain. From the 11th century onward, Galicia's position began to change. As the Christian kingdoms expanded southward, the political and economic focus of Iberia shifted. Power increasingly concentrated in regions further east and south, especially after key cities were conquered. At the same time, Galicia gradually lost territory. Areas that had once been part of the broader region of Galicia were separated, and the rise of Portugal as an independent kingdom marked a decisive break. What had once been a central and expansive region became more geographically isolated. Trade routes and communication networks also shifted, reducing the relative importance of older east-west connections like the pilgrimage road to Santiago. This transformation had lasting consequences. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Galicia had taken on a more peripheral role within the larger kingdom of Castile-Leon. However, this did not mean decline in a simple sense. Royal authority did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. Kings ruled from afar but remained involved through administrative systems, taxation, and support for towns. Urban life continued, trade expanded, and Galicia even benefited from maritime connections and participation in southern campaigns. Its people were active in broader political and military developments across Iberia. The perception of Galicia as a marginal region owes much to later interpretations shaped by national narratives. Medieval chronicles themselves often ignored or minimized its role, focusing instead on the actions of central rulers. Yet, a closer reading of historical sources shows a more complex picture. Galicia was not simply a passive province, but a region constantly negotiating its place through shifting alliances between nobles, clergy, and monarchy. Power was fluid, and legitimacy depended on the ability to maintain these relationships. A new vision of war was taking shape in the Iberian Peninsula. Reform-minded church leaders began to frame the struggle against Muslim powers as part of a much larger conflict, one that belonged to all of Latin Christendom. This idea was championed by powerful figures: the Cluniac Archbishop of Toledo, Berna, influential Burgundian nobles tied to Queen Constance, and the Queen herself. Their influence marked a turning point. The capture of Toledo did more than shift military balance. It created a strong political centre far to the south, beyond the central mountain ranges. For Galicia, this was deeply unsettling. The traditional east-west focus of the kingdom, long centred on the road to Santiago, began to fade. In its place, a new north-south orientation started to define the future. Tensions quickly followed. In Compostela, Diego Pelaez resisted these changes, likely reacting to the declining importance of Santiago as Toledo rose in prominence. There were even claims that he sought to hand Galicia over to foreign rulers, though such accusations are difficult to fully trust. What is clear is that Galicia was still widely seen as part of an older political identity rooted in the ancient region of Galicia. However, unrest among nobles, internal conflicts, and the death of King Garcia forced Alfonso VI to reconsider Galicia's position. His decision to place Raymond of Burgundy in charge of the region was not a simple administrative move. Raymond was already deeply connected to royal power, engaged in governance, and betrothed to the king's daughter, Urraca. His rule over a vast territory stretching from the Cantabrian coast to the Tagus River reflected expectations of future kingship and strengthened the influence of reformist factions aligned with the monarchy. At the centre of these developments stood a rising figure, Diego Gelmírez. Beginning as a young cleric, he quickly became a key political actor. Serving as notary and chancellor under Raymond, he gained first-hand experience in governance. His background, education, and connections positioned him perfectly to navigate the shifting landscape. While others faltered during moments of crisis, Gelmírez advanced. His early career placed him in direct contact with both ecclesiastical authority, and royal power, allowing him to observe the gradual transformation of Galicia from a once independent entity into a region caught between competing forces. The documents produced under his supervision reveal something striking. They present Raymond not merely as a noble appointed by the king, but as a ruler whose authority came directly from divine will. This was not accidental language. It reflected a growing ambition within Raymond's circle to elevate his status beyond that of a subordinate count. In these texts, power was framed as absolute, protected even from kings themselves. Such expressions hint at a political vision where Galicia might stand as a semi-independent realm under its own leadership. Yet this vision did not last. Around 1096, Alfonso VI divided the Western territories. The lands south of the Minho River were separated and given to Henry of Burgundy, while Raymond retained control of Galicia to the north. This division was more than a practical decision. It created a clear political boundary where none had existed before. The Minho River became a defining line, splitting regions that had once been united. Even long-established church jurisdictions were disrupted. From this point forward, Galicia and Portugal began to develop as distinct entities. The impact of this division was immediate. Political actions, alliances, and even religious initiatives began to reflect the new reality. One striking example comes from Gelmírez himself. In an effort to elevate the status of Santiago, he arranged the transfer of sacred relics from Braga. The operation was carried out with caution and secrecy, especially while moving through Portuguese territory. Only after crossing into Galicia did the journey become secure. The border was not just geographical, it was political, shaping decisions and defining risks. Meanwhile, in the south, new structures of power were emerging. Under Henry and later Teresa, authority was asserted through assemblies, alliances, and force. Nobles who defied the established order faced harsh consequences, including exile. Over time, these developments laid the groundwork for something entirely new: the rise of an independent Portuguese kingdom. In Galicia, however, the situation remained fluid. Alliances shifted constantly. Agreements were made and abandoned. At one point, Raymond and Henry even reached a pact concerning the future division of power after Alfonso VI's death. Plans were drawn that included the possibility of Galicia being handed over as part of a political bargain. But events moved quickly. Deaths, battles, and changing loyalties rendered these plans meaningless. The reign of Queen Urraca brought even greater instability. Multiple claims to power emerged at once. Her marriage to the King of Aragon, her own authority as queen, the ambitions of her son, Alfonso Raimundes, and the influence of Portuguese leadership all competed for dominance. In this chaotic environment, new forces entered the stage. Urban communities began to assert themselves politically, aligning with different factions depending on their interests. Their involvement signaled a shift in the structure of power, no longer limited to nobles and clergy. Among the Galician elite, figures like Pedro Froilaz played a decisive role. He supported Alfonso Raimundes and sought to shape the future of the region through strategic alliances. At times, connections with Portugal seemed promising, but these efforts ultimately failed. The decisive moment came in 1128 when Afonso Henriques defeated his rivals and secured control in the south, setting Portugal firmly on the path to independence. From that point onward, Galicia's trajectory became clearer. Its elites, including the powerful Archbishop Gelmírez, increasingly aligned themselves with the Leonese monarchy. Despite earlier ambitions and moments of near independence, Galicia became firmly integrated into a larger political framework. Even as internal conflicts continued, the direction was set. By the mid-12th century, the balance of power had shifted completely. Galicia no longer stood as a central political force, but as part of a broader kingdom. Agreements between rulers of Leon and Castile acknowledged Portugal as a separate power, while Galicia remained within the orbit of Leon. Over time, as Castile and Leon united and the frontier moved southward, Galicia's position became more peripheral. In the 13th century, two major writers brought the long Latin tradition of Iberian history, writing to one of its highest points. One was Lucas of Tuy, later known as El Tudense. The other was Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, the Archbishop of Toledo. Between them, they helped carry medieval Latin historiography into the world that would later produce the great historical writing of Alfonso X. Their works are essential for understanding how Galicia was remembered, described, and positioned within the wider history of Iberia. They also show how deeply the cult of St. James and the prestige of Santiago de Compostela had entered the political and religious imagination of the peninsula. Lucas of Tuy is remembered above all for his great historical narrative, the Chronicon Mundi, though he also wrote other works on religious subjects and controversy. Much about his early life remains uncertain, but it is clear that he spent many years in Leon, where he served as a deacon and canon at San Isidoro. Only later did he become Bishop of Tuy, a post he held until his death. His major historical work stretches from the creation of the world to the capture of Córdoba in 1236. It is a vast construction, built from many earlier texts, reshaped and connected by Lucas himself. He was not simply inventing a new history from nothing. He gathered older materials, arranged them, expanded them, and gave them new direction. Because of this method, the work often preserves the voices of earlier traditions, while also revealing his own political and ecclesiastical priorities. When Lucas writes about Galicia, he does so in a restrained way. He refers to the Galicians plainly, without the open hostility or sweeping judgment that appears in some earlier texts. Yet his interests are never neutral. He wrote from Leon, and his loyalties were strongly Leonese. Galicia enters his narrative when it becomes necessary for the larger story of kingship, warfare, rebellion, or the Christian struggle in the peninsula. In that sense, he did not place Galicia at the centre of his historical imagination in the same way a Compostelan writer would have done. Still, his chronicle contains a substantial amount of information about Galicia, especially in its later sections. Much of what he says about early medieval Galicia comes from earlier authors. He repeats notices about Asturian kings asserting control over the region, armies gathering there, and Muslim attacks devastating the land. He includes accounts of Viking raids on the Galician coast and the destruction inflicted around Santiago. He also records the sack of Santiago by Almanzor, preserving the memory of one of the most traumatic events in the region's medieval past. In these passages, Galicia appears as a territory of real strategic weight, vulnerable to attack, but also central to the defence of Christian power in the northwest. Lucas also gives attention to the way kings ruled over Galicia in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. He records the division of Fernando I's kingdom among his sons and the grant of Galicia to Garcia, preserving the memory of Galicia as a kingdom in its own right. He tells how Garcia was later imprisoned by his brother Alfonso, and how Galicia passed into Alfonso's hands. He notes the tensions surrounding Alfonso VII and Queen Urraca, showing that Galicia was not simply a distant province, but a meaningful political arena in the conflicts of succession and royal authority. Later, he records that Alfonso IX died in Galicia while on his way to Santiago to pray at the Apostles' Shrine, and that he was buried there beside his father. In these moments, Galicia appears not merely as a place on the map, but as a land bound up with dynastic legitimacy, royal memory, and sacred geography. Yet Lucas's most enduring contribution lies elsewhere. More than almost any other author, he helped shape the great martial image of St. James. In his account of the Battle of Clavijo, St. James appears dramatically as a heavenly warrior riding a white horse and coming to the aid of Christian forces. The apostle tells the king that Spain has been placed under his special protection, and he promises to fight on behalf of the Christians. The next day, as the armies clash, he appears as promised, heartening the Christians and striking down the Muslims. The image is unforgettable. Here, St. James is no longer simply a holy apostle whose relics rest in Compostela. He is a militant protector of Christian Spain, a rider in white, a patron of victory. This vision would have an enormous future. It would nourish the powerful image of Santiago Matamoros and give religious force to military ideology for centuries. Whether the Battle of Clavijo happened as described is another matter. Many later historians doubted the details, and some doubted the event altogether. But what matters for understanding Lucas is not whether the miracle can be proven. What matters is that, by his time, the story had become a meaningful part of how sacred history, royal war, and Spanish identity could be woven together. In his hands, the legend of St. James became one of the strongest links between Galicia and the larger religious imagination of Iberia. The Apostle of Compostela was no longer only Galicia's saint. He had become a protector of the whole land. Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada approached history from a very different position. As Archbishop of Toledo, he wrote from the perspective of the great ecclesiastical centre in the heart of the peninsula. His Historia de Rebus Hispaniae aimed to narrate the history of Spain as a whole, from its earliest beginnings to the reign of Fernando III. Like Lucas, he depended heavily on earlier sources, but he used them with a sharper sense of political purpose. His work presents itself as a history of all Spain, yet he never loses sight of his own position as Archbishop of Toledo. That pride and that perspective shape the narrative throughout. Because of this, Galicia appears in his work, but usually from a distance. In the earliest books, the references are mostly inherited from older traditions, especially those dealing with the Sueves and the ancient past of the peninsula. He even includes a learned and rather fanciful explanation of Galicia's name, connecting it to followers of Hercules said to have come from Galatia. Such material belongs more to medieval historical imagination than to critical history, but it is revealing in its own way. It shows that Galicia, even in these broad universal narratives, remained important enough to require an origin story. As the chronicle moves into the history of Christian Spain, Galicia becomes more visible. Jimenez de Rada writes of Asturian kings fortifying cities, such as Lugo and Tui. He records rebellions in Galicia, invasions, and the continuing importance of the region in the consolidation of Christian rule. He describes the Viking attacks on the Galician coasts and the unrest that forced kings to respond to noble opposition there. One striking passage tells of the Galicians creating a king for themselves in Santiago when they could no longer endure the conduct of Ramiro III. The detail is important because it suggests that Galicia still retained a sense of its own political identity, especially when royal legitimacy weakened. He also preserves stories already known from earlier Compostelan traditions, such as the scandalous accusations against Bishop Adolfo. In his version, the bishop is not only accused of an abominable crime, but also of promising to turn Galicia over to the Muslims. This dramatic charge does not appear in exactly the same way in every earlier source, and its presence here shows how stories could grow, change, and become more politically charged over time. The miracle that follows, in which a wild bull refuses to harm the accused bishop, retains the tone of sacred narrative, where divine judgment overrides human accusation. Like Lucas, Jimenez de Rada also deals with the division of Fernando I's kingdom and the grant of Galicia to Garcia. He recalls Garcia's later imprisonment and death, though he confuses some details in the process. He notes the upbringing of Alfonso VII in Galicia under the care of Count Pedro de Traba, preserving again the image of Galicia as a crucial setting for royal formation and succession. But when it comes to St. James, his treatment is notably more restrained than that of Lucas. He acknowledges miracles and famous interventions, including the appearance at Clavijo, but he does not dwell on them with the same intensity. The apostle remains important, but the emotional and symbolic weight is lighter. This difference is revealing. For Lucas, the figure of St. James carried immense imaginative and political force. For Jimenez de Rada, writing from Toledo, the apostle mattered, but not as the dominant sacred presence in the story of Spain. That contrast between the two authors is one of the most revealing features of 13th century Latin historiography. The differences between them are not simply matters of style or personality. They reflect different centres of gravity within medieval Iberia. Lucas wrote from a Leonese environment and preserved many concerns of the northwestern world, where Galicia and Compostela still carried enormous symbolic power. Jimenez de Rada wrote from Toledo, the restored metropolitan centre of the peninsula, and his history reflects that orientation. Both men were writing about Spain, but they were not writing from the same Spain. Taken together, their works show that Galicia still mattered deeply in the 13th century, even if its place had changed. It remained present in the memory of kingdoms, in stories of rebellion and succession, in narratives of sanctity and warfare, and above all in the enduring prestige of Santiago. Compostela was not simply a local shrine. It was one of the great sacred centres of medieval Europe, and that reality forced even authors writing far from Galicia to reckon with it. At the same time, the way they reckoned with it varied. Some treated Galicia as a vital kingdom of the past, others as a region within a wider Spanish whole. Some gave St. James a towering role in Christian victory, while others mentioned him more briefly, as one important element among many. These chronicles therefore do more than preserve facts. They reveal perspective. They show how medieval writers ranked territories, shaped memories, and organised the past according to the needs of their own age. Galicia appears in them not as a fixed idea, but as something contested, remembered differently, depending on where the writer stood. In one telling, it is the land of St. James, guardian of Spain and source of miraculous victory. In another, it is a kingdom absorbed into a larger historical order. In yet another, it is the setting for rebellion, burial, pilgrimage, and royal transition. Through all of these versions, one truth remains clear. Galicia was too important to disappear from the historical imagination of medieval Iberia, even when others tried to place newer centres of power above it. By the time these two great authors were writing, the old Hispano-Latin historical tradition was reaching its end, and a new age of vernacular history was beginning. Yet Lucas of Tui and Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada stand at that turning point with immense authority. They gathered older memory, reshaped it, and passed it on to later generations. Thanks to them, the medieval image of Galicia survived not only in local memory, but in the wider historical consciousness of Iberia.